Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into The Fiction Wizard. Presenting to you today, Harry hired 12 Goblin lawyers at age 9 and sued Dumbledore for every property. Wizengamot stripped him of all titles. Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1. The audit. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harry would later think was appropriate. Nothing important ever happened on a Monday. Mondays were for getting hit, for burning toast, for Dudley sitting on him until his ribs ached. Tuesdays, though. Tuesdays had a kind of sharp, unexpected energy to them, like a knife left point up on the counter. He almost didn't see it. The post came through the slot in the front door at 7:30 in the morning, and Dudley had already thundered downstairs to sort through it for catalogues and anything that looked like it might contain money or vouchers. Harry was in the kitchen, standing on the step stool Aunt Petunia made him use so he could reach the hob, watching 4 rashers of bacon spit and curl in the pan. He'd learned very early that if the bacon burned, it was his fault, and if Dudley didn't get enough, that was also his fault, and if Uncle Vernon's eggs were too runny, same story. Cooking had turned him into a very precise, very attentive 9-year-old, which was probably not what the Dursleys intended. "Nothing," Dudley announced from the hall, dropping a fistful of flyers on the floor. Then, after a pause, "There's a weird one." "Leave it," Aunt Petunia said without looking up from her coffee. "It's got Harry's name on it." The silence that followed was the kind Harry had learned to read like weather. This particular silence meant, this is unexpected and therefore threatening. He turned the bacon with a fork, keeping his back to the door, watching steam rise off the pan. His ears were doing all the work. "Give it here." Petunia's chair scraped. A pause. Then her voice changed, went tight and thin, like a wire pulled too taut. "Vernon." That was all she said. Just his name. But Vernon was already coming down the stairs in his dressing gown, each footfall heavy as a judge's gavel. Harry didn't turn around. He heard the letter being opened. He heard Vernon read whatever was on the page. Then he heard a sound he'd never quite heard from Vernon Dursley before, something between a cough and a word that got swallowed back down before it could become a sentence. "Boy," Vernon said finally. "Come here." Harry turned off the bacon, stepped off the step stool, and walked into the hallway. The letter was a heavy cream color, thick as cardstock, with a seal at the top that showed a goblin standing between 2 crossed keys. Even from 3 feet away, the embossing looked expensive. Everything about it looked expensive. Harry looked at it the way he looked at most things that weren't his, carefully, from a distance, not touching. "This is for me," he said. "Don't get smart." Vernon's face had gone the color of old brick. "What did you do?" "I haven't done anything." "Then why is a bank writing to you?" Harry looked at the letter again. Gringotts Wizarding Bank, London. Below that, in smaller print, Office of Inheritance and Estate Management. Notice of scheduled audit, mandatory attendance. And below that, his name, written in ink so dark it was almost purple. Harry James Potter. Ward designation, active. Account status, restricted. Audit date, this Friday, 14th August, 10 a.m. "I don't know," Harry said. He wasn't lying. He genuinely didn't know. But something had shifted in his chest when he read the words account status, restricted, the way something shifts when you pull a loose thread and feel the whole seam begin to give. Vernon took the letter back. "We're ignoring it." "It says mandatory," Harry said. "I know what it says. I have a university degree, thank you very much. It also says there are legal penalties for non-attendance of a named account holder." Harry had read fast, in the few seconds he'd had the letter. He was good at reading fast. It was useful in a house where information was either weaponized or withheld. "I'm the named account holder." Vernon's eyes narrowed. "How do you even know what that means?" "I read." The silence stretched. Petunia was looking at the letter with an expression Harry couldn't quite categorize, not quite fear, not quite guilt, something more complicated than either. She knew something. She always knew something, and she always buried it under lavender sachets and frantic housework in a particular way of not looking at him directly. "Take him," she said quietly. Vernon turned to her. "Petunia, take him, Vernon. Let them deal with it, and then it's done, and we don't have to think about it anymore." That was Friday decided. Gringotts was everything Privet Drive was not. Harry had been to London twice in his life, once for Dudley's birthday trip to the Natural History Museum, where he'd spent the whole day 3 steps behind everyone else, and once when Aunt Petunia needed new curtains from a shop on Oxford Street. Both times, London had felt enormous and indifferent, which was fine. Enormous and indifferent was better than small and hostile. But Diagon Alley was something else entirely. They got there through a pub, which Harry found significant. He filed it away the way he filed everything, not with excitement, not with obvious reaction, because obvious reactions in front of the Dursleys were invitations for things to be taken away. But he looked. He looked at everything. The brick wall that moved. The street that unfolded behind it like a sentence he'd been reading wrong his entire life. The robes and the owls and the cauldron stacked outside a shop and the smell of something burnt and sweet and unfamiliar. Vernon walked like a man navigating a minefield, shoulders up, jaw tight, touching nothing. Dudley was home with Mrs. Figg. Petunia had sent them off with a muttered "be back by noon," and closed the door before Harry could ask any questions. So it was just Vernon and Harry, and the look on Vernon's face said clearly that he considered this Harry's fault in every conceivable way. The bank was white and enormous. The goblins at the door were shorter than Harry expected and meaner looking than he'd imagined anything could look. One of them examined the letter with the focused attention of a surgeon examining an X-ray, then handed it back without speaking and waved them through. Inside, the hall was marble and noise and money, or the smell of money, which Harry had learned was different from the smell of actual money. Actual money smelled like copper and old fabric. The smell in Gringotts was older than that. It smelled like something that had been accumulating for a very long time. A goblin at the far end of the central counter looked up from his ledger. "Name?" "Harry Potter," Harry said. The goblin looked at him the way one might look at a document that had been misfiled. "Age?" 9. A pause. The goblin wrote something. "Follow me." "I'm his guardian," Vernon announced. "I'll be accompanying, you are not named in the summons," the goblin said, without looking up. "You may wait." Vernon turned the color of a rare steak. "Now listen here, or leave," the goblin offered. "Those are your options." Harry walked away before Vernon could find his voice again. The room they took him to was small compared to the grand hall outside, but small in the way that some rooms manage to feel larger than they are, lined floor to ceiling with dark wooden shelves, every shelf stacked with folders and ledgers and small locked boxes. There was a round table in the center, heavy enough to have its own gravity, with 3 chairs on one side and one on the other. Harry took the single chair without being asked, because it seemed obvious that was his side. 3 goblins came in. The one in the middle was old, not old the way teachers were old, or even old the way Mrs. Figg was old. He was old the way the bank building was old, in a way that had stopped being about age and become about weight. His skin was the color of old parchment and his eyes were sharp and yellow and entirely without warmth. He sat down, placed a stack of folders on the table, and looked at Harry with an expression that was the closest thing to professional respect Harry had ever been given by anyone. "I am Ragnarok," the goblin said. "These are my associates Griphook and Sharpclaw. We are the auditing division assigned to Estate Potter. You are the ward and primary beneficiary, Harry James Potter, and this is your mandatory inheritance audit, required under Section 41 of the Goblin Banking Accord of 1792, which states that all restricted accounts must be reviewed in the presence of the named beneficiary upon reaching the age of cognitive legal standing, which the Accord defines as age 9. Harry folded his hands on the table. What does restricted mean? Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened the top folder. It means that your account has been placed under a management order. Access to your funds, your properties, and your legal instruments is currently held by a designated guardian. Who designated them? That is an excellent question. Ragnarok's tone didn't change, but something shifted in those yellow eyes: interest, maybe, or recognition. The management order was placed by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, citing emergency guardianship provisions under the Post-War Wizarding Protection Act of 1981. Harry absorbed this. And the person who was actually supposed to manage my estate? Ragnarok placed a sheet of paper on the table and pushed it across. Under your parents' will, primary guardianship was assigned to Sirius Orain Black, with secondary assignment to Frank and Alice Longbottom. The will was formally read at the Ministry of Magic on November 3, 1981, 5 days after your parents' deaths. So they knew, Harry said. Not a question. They knew, Ragnarok confirmed, with the flat certainty of someone reading from a ledger. The will was witnessed, registered, and then superseded by the emergency order 48 hours later. What happened to Sirius Black? Imprisoned. Without trial. Ragnarok paused. I should note, for the record, that I am presenting you with facts. What conclusions you draw from them is your own business. Harry looked at the sheet of paper. His parents' will, or a copy of it. His mother's handwriting was at the bottom, and he stared at it for a full 5 seconds before he made himself look away, because this was not the moment for that. Show me the accounts, he said. It took 2 hours. 2 hours was how long it took Ragnarok and his associates to walk Harry through the full scope of what he owned, what he'd been meant to own, and what had been quietly redirected in the 5 years since his parents died. Harry didn't speak much during those 2 hours. He asked precise questions. He asked for documents to be repeated when he wanted to be sure. He didn't raise his voice, because raised voices were what you did when you'd already run out of better options, and he hadn't yet. The Potter family vault, his direct inheritance, contained enough gold to make Vernon Dursley's eyes water for a week. That was the small part. The Potter estate also included 3 properties in Britain, 1 in France, 1 in Ireland, a seat on the Wizengamot, currently being held in proxy by the chief warlock, who was Dumbledore, voting rights in 4 separate wizarding governance committees, a controlling share in a potions ingredient company, and something called the Potter Family Trust, which had been accruing interest since 1453 and was currently managed by a ministry official named Cornelius Fudge. Fudge, Harry repeated. He was appointed by Minister Millicent Bagnold on the recommendation of, Griphook checked a note. Albus Dumbledore. Right. Harry looked at the numbers on the page. He'd only recently been doing long multiplication in school, but he could follow the columns well enough to understand that the trust had been making withdrawals. Regular, modest, carefully sized withdrawals that wouldn't look dramatic on their own but added up, over 5 years, to a number that made him feel something cold move through his chest. Who authorized these withdrawals? The management order gives Dumbledore co-signatory rights over the trust, Sharpclaw said. He was the youngest of the 3, and he'd been watching Harry with something that might have been fascination. As co-signatory, he can authorize distributions to approved third parties. And these third parties are? The list was 7 names long. Harry recognized 2 of them from the documents he'd already read. Both were members of something called the Order of the Phoenix, which Ragnarok explained, with great economy of expression, was a private organization founded by Dumbledore during the war. So he's been paying his own people from my family's trust, Harry said. That is one interpretation, Ragnarok said carefully. Is there another interpretation? Ragnarok said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Harry sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was low and stone and practical, nothing decorative about it, which he appreciated, and he did what he always did when something large and complicated landed on him at once. He sorted it. Put the biggest things on one side. Put the questions on the other. Looked for the shape of it. He'd been doing this since he was 6, which was when he'd figured out that Dudley always started hitting him on the left side because Dudley was right-handed and led with his right, which meant if Harry moved left first, Dudley would overcorrect and miss. Understanding the structure of a problem was the first step to surviving it. This problem was bigger than Dudley. But it had a structure. "I have one more question," he said. "Only one?" said Ragnarok, and it was the first time Harry had heard something in the Goblin's voice that might, if you squinted at it from the right angle, be called amusement. "For now. Can I contest the management order?" The 3 Goblins looked at each other. Not in a worried way, more the way people look at each other when something they half expected finally happens. "You can," Ragnarok said slowly. "Under Section 41 of the Accord, a beneficiary who achieves cognitive legal standing has the right to petition for full or partial removal of a management order. The petition must be filed with both Gringotts and the Ministry's Department of Magical Law, must include a formal accounting of grievances, and must be brought before a panel of no fewer than 3 qualified arbiters. How long does that take? If the filing is complete and properly structured, the Ministry is required to acknowledge it within 30 days and schedule a hearing within 90. Harry did the maths. So by November. If the filing is done correctly. Ragnarok paused. These matters are typically handled by a qualified magical solicitor. "I know," Harry said. "Do you have any?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had texture to it. Ragnarok looked at Griphook, who looked at Sharpclaw, who looked at the ceiling with an expression that might have been either professional neutrality or barely suppressed enthusiasm. "Gringotts does not, as a general rule, involve itself in human legal proceedings," Ragnarok said. "I know that too," Harry said. "I'm asking if you have solicitors." "The bank employs a legal division," Ragnarok said carefully. "Their primary function is to protect Goblin interests in contractual matters. Would protecting those interests overlap with my case?" Ragnarok looked at him for a long time. Then he picked up one of the folders and opened it to a page near the back. He turned it around and pushed it across the table. Harry looked at it. It was a list, a long, dense, annotated list of assets, agreements, and instruments that the Potter estate held in partnership with Gringotts itself. 3 of them were long-term vaulting agreements. One was a loan from 1823 that had been refinanced 6 times and still ran. 2 were joint custodial arrangements over cursed objects the Potters had apparently agreed to store on behalf of the bank. "As you can see," Ragnarok said, "the bank has a direct contractual interest in the stability and proper management of the Potter estate. A management order that improperly redirects estate funds or places estate assets under non-contracted authority could be construed as a breach of those agreements." Harry looked up from the document. "So you can argue the case as a breach of contract. It is possible that the bank's interests and your interests are significantly aligned," Ragnarok said, with the air of someone who had thought about this a great deal before this meeting and had been waiting to see if the 9-year-old sitting across from him was sharp enough to follow the thread. Harry thought about Vernon waiting in the lobby, furious and confused. He thought about the dormitory at school where he slept on a cot in the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about his mother's handwriting at the bottom of a piece of paper, and the trust that had been bleeding money to men who worked for the person who decided Harry didn't need his parents' first choice of guardian. He thought about the management order, and the word superseded, and the 48 hours. "I want to file the petition," he said. "And I want the bank's legal division to co-sign it as an interested party." How many solicitors would that involve? Ragnarok folded his hands on the table. "The division has 12 qualified solicitors currently available for external assignment." "All 12, Harry said. Griphook made a very small, very controlled sound. Sharpclaw pressed his lips together hard. Ragnarok looked at Harry Potter, 9 years old, wearing a t-shirt 3 sizes too big for him, with a scar on his forehead and his mother's eyes and his father's absolute refusal to look away from anything, and he said, that would be unprecedented. Good, Harry said. So was stealing from me. Vernon was still in the lobby when Harry came back out. He'd worked himself into a state, judging by the color, and he stood up the moment he saw Harry coming and opened his mouth to deliver whatever speech he'd been rehearsing. "We're done," Harry said, walking past him. "I need to come back next week to sign some papers, but we can go now." "What papers? What's going on?" Harry pushed through the front door of the bank and stood on the marble steps for a moment, looking out at the alley. A witch in purple robes was arguing with a vendor about the price of something in a box. Two men were sharing a copy of the Daily Prophet. An owl shot overhead like a brown arrow. "Nothing you need to worry about," Harry said. Which was true. It wasn't Vernon's problem. It had never been Vernon's problem. Vernon had just been the fence the bird was kept behind. Boy. Vernon had caught up and was looming, which was his primary social skill. "You tell me what's happening right now, or so help me, you can't actually do anything to me in public," Harry observed, not looking at him. "Too many witnesses. You never hit me in public. I noticed that 2 years ago." He turned and looked up at his uncle. "We can go back to Privet Drive, and I'll make dinner, and you can pretend this didn't happen. Or you can cause a scene in front of a bank full of people who seem like they might have feelings about that sort of thing." He glanced at the Goblin guards at the door, both of whom were watching with expressions of sharpened professional interest. "Your choice." Vernon opened his mouth. Closed it. Went through several colors. They walked back to the pub entrance in silence. Harry spent the whole walk back thinking about timelines, and filing fees, and what the word discovery meant in a legal context. He'd read enough at school to know the basics. He was going to need to read a great deal more. He had time. He was 9. The following Friday, Harry returned to Gringotts alone. He'd managed it the same way he managed most things, by being invisible. Aunt Petunia had her garden club. Vernon was at work. Dudley was at a friend's house. Mrs. Fig, who was supposed to be watching him, had a cat with a bad hip that needed more attention than usual, and Harry had slipped out through the garden gate at 8:30 with the money he'd taken, coin by coin over 18 months, from the change tray on the hallway table, £12.40, which turned out to be enough for the bus to the Leaky Cauldron if you knew which bus to take. He'd looked it up in the phone book. Ragnarok was already in the small room when Harry arrived, along with 11 other goblins. Not the small secondary office from the week before, they'd moved to a conference room on the lower level, accessed through a door Harry hadn't noticed before, down a corridor that slanted gradually and pleasantly downward in a way that suggested a very long drop at some point in its history. The new room had a longer table. 12 chairs on one side. One on the other. Harry sat in his chair, looked at the 12 goblins across from him, and said, "Tell me what I need to know." It took 4 hours. They went through everything, the legal framework for the petition, the specific claims they were filing, the evidence already in hand from the bank's own records, and the evidence they'd need to gather. Each goblin handled a different component: financial fraud, improper management, breach of contractual duty, violation of estate law, improper invocation of the emergency guardianship provisions, the serious black question, the will suppression, the Wizengamot seat, the trust distributions, the properties that had been donated to various causes without beneficiary consent, and something Ragnarok saved for last. "There is a matter," he said, "that is somewhat outside the financial claims." Harry waited. "Your parents made additional provisions in their will that have not been executed. A letter, to be delivered to you at age 11. A bequest of personal objects, currently unaccounted for. And a formal declaration of magical heritage status, identifying you as heir to not 1 but 3 families." Harry felt the cold thing in his chest again. 3. The Potters are the most recent line. But your paternal grandmother was born Doria Black, which makes you a collateral heir to the ancient and noble house of Black. And your mother, whose blood work is on file here, from your birth registration, carries a line we traced back, with some difficulty, to a squib branch of the ancient house of Peveril. The room was very quiet. Peveril, Harry repeated. The line is tenuous, Griphook said, from his seat 2 down from Ragnarok. But under wizarding inheritance law, tenuous is still valid. It would require challenge hearings to formalize, but the claim exists. So I hold provisional heir status to 3 noble houses, Harry said slowly. Provisional, Ragnarok agreed. Though in the case of the Potter and Black lines, the evidence is considerably more than provisional. The Black connection alone means the Wizengamot seat, Harry said. The Black family has one too. 2, actually, Sharpclaw said, from the end of the table, consulting his notes. 1 direct, 1 through a cadet branch that lapsed when Arcturus Black died without confirmed male issue. Arguable, but arguable in your favor. Harry looked at the table. Not at the papers on it, just at the table itself, the grain of the dark wood, the way the lamp above it cast a clean circle of light. He was 9 years old. He lived in a cupboard under a staircase. He had £12.40 in his pocket and a 12-person legal team that smelled faintly of gold and something older than gold. Build the filing around all 3 houses, he said. If we're doing this, we're doing it completely. Ragnarok picked up a quill. Very well. I will need you to sign 3 retainer agreements, 1 for each house, and a co-signatory authorization for the bank's interest claim. He paused. I am obliged to inform you that these documents, once signed, cannot be revoked without the agreement of all parties and a formal court order. I know, Harry said. You understand what this action will set in motion. I understand. It will create significant opposition. Powerful opposition. Harry looked at him. Ragnarok. Someone signed a piece of paper 48 hours after my parents died and used it to take everything I was supposed to have. Then they put me in a cupboard and left me there for 5 years. He picked up the quill. Tell me where to sign. Ragnarok watched him for a moment. Then he slid the first retainer across the table. The ink was black and it dried immediately, sinking into the parchment like it had always been there. 11 more goblins picked up their own quills. And the most expensive, most complicated, most seismically consequential legal action in the history of the British wizarding world began on a Friday morning in August, in a room below a bank, with a 9-year-old boy and 12 goblins who had decided, for reasons of their own, that this particular fight was worth having. Outside, in the alley, the day went on. People bought cauldrons and owls and ingredients for potions. The Daily Prophet vendor argued about change. 2 witches argued about something that had apparently happened at a Quidditch match. None of them knew yet. They would. The notice of claim was filed that same afternoon, but the delivery didn't happen until the following Monday. Ragnarok had explained the timing with the calm precision of someone who understood that where a stone landed mattered less than when. Monday morning, he said, when the ministry was fully staffed and the Daily Prophet's morning edition was already at the printers. The delivery would be too late for Monday's paper, which meant it would hit Tuesday's edition when people were actually paying attention. Tuesday, Harry thought. Appropriate. He was back in his cupboard by 6 on Friday evening, cooking dinner by 7, in bed by 9. He lay on his narrow cot in the dark and stared at the sloped ceiling above him, bare wood, 2 nails someone had hammered in years ago and never removed, and he did not feel triumphant. He didn't think this was the kind of thing that came with triumph attached, not yet. What he felt was something cleaner than that. Something like the feeling after you've solved a very long equation and checked your working and found no errors. He'd found the thread on Tuesday. Now he'd pulled it. The question was how much of the seam came apart. He closed his eyes and went to sleep, because he was 9, and it had been a very long week, and there was nothing more to be done tonight. Tomorrow Aunt Petunia would want him to weed the garden, and he'd weed it, because he was still living in her house, and he wasn't foolish enough to forget the difference between having a legal case and having somewhere to sleep. Some fights you won in rooms full of lawyers. Some you won by being invisible until you were ready not to be. He was not ready yet. He would be. 3 days later, in a large stone office on the 7th floor of a building that most of London had walked past without ever seeing, Albus Dumbledore opened a thick cream-colored envelope with his name on it. He read it once. Set it down. Then picked it up and read it again, more slowly. His phoenix, Fawkes, shifted on his perch. The sound he made was not the usual song, it was quieter, more questioning. Dumbledore looked out the window at the grey London sky. He thought about a scar. He thought about a prophecy. He thought about the careful, necessary architecture of the last 5 years, and the 48 hours in which he'd built it, and the very particular 9-year-old he'd placed at the center of it for what he still believed, fiercely and completely, were the right reasons. Then he thought about 12 Goblin signatures at the bottom of a legal notice, and a boy who had apparently walked into Gringotts and walked out with an army. He set the letter down again, very carefully, and sat still for a long time. "Well," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "I didn't expect that." Fawkes said nothing. Outside, the grey sky began to rain. Chapter 2, The Brief. The Daily Prophet ran it on a Tuesday, as Ragnarok had planned. Harry knew because Mrs. Figg came to the door at 8:30 in the morning with her cat Tibbles under one arm and an expression on her face like she'd swallowed a marble. She rang the bell twice, fast, which she never did. Aunt Petunia answered in her dressing gown and they had a very short, very tense conversation in the doorway that Harry couldn't hear from the kitchen, where he was making porridge and pretending to be invisible. He heard his name twice. Both times it came out of Mrs. Figg's mouth in a whisper that was trying very hard to be a whisper and failing. Then Petunia came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before, not the usual sourness, not the brittle contempt. Something more complicated. Something that, if she'd been anyone else, might have been close to fear. "Eat your breakfast," she said finally. "And stay in today." That was all she said. She didn't ask questions. She didn't bring out the prophet, which she wouldn't have had anyway. The Dursleys read the regular newspaper and regarded the idea of a magical one with the particular horror they reserved for anything that acknowledged the existence of a world they decided to pretend wasn't there. But Harry knew. He'd known since Friday what Tuesday would look like. He ate his porridge and stayed in and waited, because that was the move. The move after that happened at noon, when an owl arrived. Not a Dursley owl, obviously, the Dursleys would sooner have kept a crocodile. It came through Harry's bedroom window, which was technically the window of the cupboard under the stairs, which didn't have a window, except that apparently it did now, which Harry only discovered when the owl appeared in it and he realized the wall beside his cot had developed a neat circular opening that smelled faintly of something metallic and purposeful. The owl was large, grey, and businesslike, and it dropped a roll of parchment on his pillow with the air of a professional completing a job. Harry unrolled it. It was from Ragnarok. Short, clean, matter-of-fact. The notice was delivered at 7 a.m. to 17 recipients, including the named defendants, the Ministry Department of Magical Law, the Wizengamot Clerk's Office, and the Daily Prophet. 3 recipients have already requested urgent meetings. The Ministry has 48 hours to formally acknowledge receipt under the accord. We will speak on Thursday. Do not engage with any representatives of the named defendants before that meeting. Are 17 recipients. Harry read that again. He'd known Ragnarok was going to be thorough. He hadn't quite understood what thorough looked like at this scale. He rolled the parchment back up, tucked it under his mattress, and went to weed the garden, because Aunt Petunia had told him to stay in and he'd decided staying in applied to the house, not the garden, and anyway he did his best thinking with his hands in the dirt. Thursday meant another trip to Gringotts, and getting there alone was becoming a system. The system worked like this: Aunt Petunia's garden club met every Thursday at 10, which meant she left at 9:45 and came back at 12:30. Vernon was at work. Dudley was at school. Mrs. Fig had been told Harry was going to the library, which was technically the direction the bus went before it turned toward central London, so it wasn't entirely a lie. Harry was at the Leaky Cauldron by 10 past 10 and in the lower conference room by 20 past, and Ragnok was already there with two pieces of news, a cup of something that steamed and smelled like bark, and an expression that was as close to excited as Harry suspected Ragnok's face ever got. 12 requests for meeting have now been received, Ragnok said, setting a folder on the table. The ministry acknowledged receipt at 6 this morning, which is 42 hours after delivery and therefore inside the required window. However, he paused, and Harry had come to understand that Ragnok's pauses meant something worth paying attention to. The acknowledgement letter was signed by Cornelius Fudge. "Who is a named defendant?" Harry said. "Who is a named defendant?" Ragnok confirmed. "And who, under Section 12 of the Ministry's own Conflicts of Interest Code, is prohibited from acting in any official capacity in matters where he holds a direct financial interest." "Which he does," Harry said. "The trust." "The trust." Ragnok allowed himself a small, thin smile. It was the smile of someone watching a trap spring. "We filed a conflict notice at 8 this morning. Fudge has been formally recused. The acknowledgement has been reassigned to the Department of Magical Law under Acting Director Amelia Bones." Harry turned this over. "Is Bones good?" Ragnok considered this for a moment. "She is competent, principled, and not a named defendant. In the current circumstances, that makes her exceptional." Harry nodded. "The meeting requests. Who's asking?" Ragnok opened the folder. "Dumbledore's personal solicitor. The Ministry Legal Office, which is now Bones's office. 2 separate reporters from the Daily Prophet, we declined both. Representatives from the Wizengamot Secretariat. A witch named Minerva McGonagall, who appears to have sent hers personally rather than through any official channel." He paused at the next name. "And one from Narcissa Malfoy, née Black, requesting a private consultation regarding what she calls a matter of family interest." "Black," Harry said. "She is your cousin, technically. Very technically, the relationship is through Doria Black, your paternal grandmother." Harry filed that away. "What about Dumbledore himself?" "Nothing directly from Dumbledore." Ragnok set down the folder. "Which is interesting. It means he's thinking," Harry said. "If he panicked, he'd have sent someone immediately." Ragnok looked at him in that way he'd started doing, measuring, recalibrating. "Yes. That's what it means. We don't take any of these meetings yet," Harry said. "Not until after the Ministry's formal response. If we meet with Dumbledore's solicitor before the response comes in, it looks like we're negotiating. I don't want to look like we're negotiating." "You're not negotiating?" "Not yet." Harry looked at the folder. "When the formal response comes in, what will it say?" "That depends on who wrote it. If Fudge retained any informal influence, it will attempt to challenge your standing, argue that a 9-year-old cannot be a primary petitioner under wizarding law. If Bones controls it, it will likely be procedurally neutral, acknowledging the filing without committing to an outcome." "And if they challenge my standing?" Ragnok's expression didn't change. "Then we invoke the Accord. The 1792 Accord predates the Ministry by 12 years. Its provisions on cognitive legal standing supersede the Ministry's age restrictions in matters of inheritance. They know that. Challenging it would be losing publicly before a single hearing convenes." "Good," Harry said. "I want them to know we know that too. I'll have Griphook draft a preparatory brief." Ragnok folded his hands on the table. "There is one more thing." Harry waited. "The Daily Prophet's front page." Ragnok slid a cutting across the table. Harry picked it up. The headline was big enough to be visible from a moderate distance, which was presumably the point. "Potter heir files against Dumbledore, Gringotts backs claim." Below that, in smaller type, "Boy who lived, age 9, launches inheritance challenge with unprecedented bank support. Wizarding World asks, where has he been? Harry read the article. It was, he supposed, fair. It recounted the basic facts of the filing without revealing the specific allegations, which was correct because Ragnarok had filed under partial seal, releasing only the headings. It described him as the sole heir of James and Lily Potter, currently residing with Muggle relatives, and included a sentence about the Gringotts co-signature that the journalist clearly found astonishing. The last paragraph was the most interesting. Sources within the Wizengamot have confirmed that the Potter family seat has been held in proxy by Chief Warlock Dumbledore since 1981. If the petition succeeds, the implications for the balance of power in wizarding governance are, the sentence ended there, cut off by the edge of the clipping. What did the rest of it say? Harry asked. Difficult to overstate, Ragnarok said. Harry set the cutting down. He thought about that for a moment, not with pleasure exactly, but with the particular focus that came with understanding the shape of something. The prophet piece wasn't just news. It was a signal, sent to every person in the wizarding world who had an opinion about Dumbledore, the Ministry, the war, and the boy who was supposed to be safely filed away in a house in Surrey. The signal said, he's here. He's awake. And he has lawyers. The McGonagall request, Harry said. She sent it personally. Handwritten. Through a school owl rather than an official channel. Ragnarok paused. I believe she is acting independently of Dumbledore on this one. Why would she do that? I couldn't speculate. He paused again, which meant he could speculate but was choosing not to, which was its own form of information. She was close to your parents, by all accounts. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, set up the McGonagall meeting. Not here, somewhere neutral. And not until after the Ministry response. He stood, pushing his chair back. I need books. Ragnarok raised an eyebrow, which was a significant event on his face. Books. Legal texts. The Accord, obviously, but also the history of Wizengamot proceedings, inheritance law, the specific statutes governing post-war emergency orders. Everything that's relevant to our case. I want to read the originals, not summaries. You're 9, Griphook said, from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly. I know, Harry said. That's why I have time. Griphook looked at Sharpclaw. Sharpclaw looked at the ceiling. I'll have them sent to you, Ragnarok said. Through the owl. Is there a better address? Harry thought about the cupboard, and the new window that had appeared in the wall, which he was still not entirely sure how to account for. The one you used before is fine. He left the bank into a bright August morning, London moving around him in all its enormous indifference, and went to catch his bus. The books arrived that evening, shrunk to the size of a paperback and wrapped in plain brown paper, delivered by the grey owl who'd apparently decided the cupboard window was now its regular stop. Harry expanded them one at a time. The magic seemed to happen automatically when he held them and thought bigger, which was interesting, and stacked them under his cot. 7 volumes in total. Goblin Banking Accords, Annotated Legal Edition. Wizengamot Procedure and Precedent, Volume 1 and 2. Post-War Reconstruction, Ministry Powers and Limitations. Wizarding Inheritance Law, A Comprehensive Guide. And 2 others that were smaller and older and written in a style that made Harry's head hurt slightly but which he suspected were the most important. He read by torchlight with his cot wedged against the door, which was a habit from age 6, and he read the way he read everything, fast and with a pencil, marking anything that seemed significant. He developed a shorthand over the first 2 nights, a star for things that helped them, a circle for things that might be used against them, a small d for anything that seemed specifically designed to protect people in Dumbledore's position, which was more frequent than he liked. By Sunday he had a system. By Monday he had questions. He sent them to Ragnarok by owl, 4 tight pages of them, and got back a response from Griphook on Tuesday morning that said, "These are good questions. We are already arguing most of them. The ones we aren't arguing yet, we should be. Meeting Friday? Harry sent back, Friday. Then he went to make breakfast. The ministry's formal response came on Wednesday, and it was, as Ragnarok had predicted, signed by Amelia Bones. It was also, as Harry read it in the lower conference room on Friday morning with all 12 goblins arranged in their chairs, considerably more interesting than procedurally neutral. "She's not just acknowledging the filing," said Brickshaw, the fourth most senior goblin, who handled ministry procedure, from his position at the far end of the table. "She's specifically noting that the conflict recusal of Fudge has generated an internal review. The review covers his management of the Potter Trust. She opened an investigation without us asking her to," Harry said. "It appears so." Harry looked at the response letter again. It was written in formal ministry language, dense and hedged, but once you knew how to read that kind of language, and Harry had spent the last 2 weeks learning how, what it said was clear enough. Amelia Bones had received the filing, recused Fudge, and then, apparently on her own authority, looked at what Fudge had actually been doing with the trust, and what she'd found had been interesting enough for her to formally flag it. "She's an ally," Harry said. "Potentially," Ragnarok said. "Or she's someone who follows the law regardless of where it points, which amounts to the same thing in this case. Can we meet with her? If you'd like. It would be unusual. Petitioners rarely meet directly with ministry investigators during the pre-hearing phase." "Unusual seems to be working for us," Harry said. "Set it up." He looked down at the letter again. Amelia Bones. He made a mental note of the name the way he made mental notes of everything, carefully, in a place he'd find it later. "The Narcissa Malfoy request," he said. "What does she actually want?" Ragnarok exchanged a brief glance with Griphook. "We believe she wants to assert a family interest in the Black estate proceedings. The Black family claims are, as we've discussed, complex. If your claim to collateral heir status for the ancient House of Black is upheld, it affects the Black family's own succession in ways that, depending on how the hearing goes, could either support or challenge the current management of the Black estate." "Who currently manages the Black estate?" "Technically, Arcturus Black left no confirmed will. The estate is in a form of suspended management, it's accruing, slowly, in a ministry holding account." "And Narcissa wants?" "We believe," Ragnarok said carefully, "that she would like to see the Black estate settled in a way that ensures her son's inheritance is protected. The Malfoy family fortune is substantial independently, but the Black legacy carries a political and social weight that," he paused. "Let us say she is a pragmatic woman who is good at identifying which direction the wind is turning." "She wants to be on the winning side," Harry said. "She wants her son to be on the winning side," Ragnarok corrected. "Which is not quite the same thing." Harry thought about this. A mother who would navigate the entire wizarding political landscape for her child. He wasn't sure if that was admirable or terrifying. Maybe both. "Let her come," he said. "But not yet. After the ministry response is processed and the hearing date is set. I want her coming to us from a position of necessity rather than strategy." Griphook offered. "I was going to say certainty," Harry said. "I want her coming because she's certain about which way this is going. Not just hoping." Griphook made a small sound that was absolutely not a laugh. The meeting with McGonagall happened on a Saturday, in a tea room in Muggle London that Ragnarok's office had selected with the specific logic that it was the last place any wizard would think to look for a meeting between the heir of Potter and a Hogwarts professor. It was a small place, 4 tables, floral tablecloths, the kind that smelled like very old tea and a cat that lived somewhere in the back. Harry arrived first, because arriving first was always better. He ordered tea and a scone, because ordering something was less conspicuous than sitting without anything, and he waited. McGonagall was exactly on time. She walked in with the posture of someone who had spent decades maintaining posture as a matter of principle, wearing dark green robes that she'd modified somehow to look, not quite like a regular coat, but close enough that the Muggle couple at the next table didn't look up. She spotted Harry immediately, which didn't surprise him. He suspected McGonagall had been spotting people immediately her entire life. She sat down. She ordered nothing. She looked at him. He looked back. "You have your mother's eyes," she said, and her voice was steady but something behind it was not. "Everyone says that," Harry said. "I've never actually known what to do with it." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been planning this?" "Since August 3rd. She blinked. "That's 3 weeks, yes." He picked up his tea. "I work fast." "You work," she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Started again. "I want you to understand that I am not here representing Albus Dumbledore. I want that on the record before we say anything else. I know. You sent through a school owl. He doesn't know I'm here. Also good." Harry set down his tea. "Why are you here, then?" McGonagall's hands were folded on the table. They were very still, the stillness of someone who had practiced not giving things away. But she was giving things away anyway, in the fine line between her brows and the way her eyes moved when she looked at him. "I was your parents' head of house," she said. "At Hogwarts. I taught them both. I was the one who recommended them for several things. I cared about them." A pause. "When they died, I trusted that the people making decisions about your welfare were acting in your best interests." "Were they?" "I believed so. I didn't ask enough questions." The fine line deepened. "I should have. I've thought about that many times in the last 8 years." Harry looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it would mean, strategically, to have a Hogwarts professor as a witness. He thought about what she obviously knew about his parents. Then he set the strategy aside for a moment and just looked at her, because she was the first person he'd met in this entire venture who seemed to feel something about what had happened to his parents that wasn't about power or money or politics. "What did you know?" he asked. "About the will? About any of it?" McGonagall was quiet for long enough that the Muggle couple at the next table paid their bill, gathered their things, and left. "I knew the will named Sirius," she said finally. "Dumbledore told me that it was impossible, that Sirius had been revealed as a Death Eater and was being sent to Azkaban. That the emergency provisions were necessary." She met Harry's eyes. "I didn't know about the trust management. I didn't know about the withdrawals. I didn't know the estate had been used," Harry said. She flinched, very slightly. "Yes. Were you going to do anything about it?" "I didn't know there was anything to," she stopped. "No. That's not honest. I knew you were with the Dursleys. I knew that wasn't what the will said. I told myself it had been handled correctly." Her voice was very level. "I told myself Albus knew best. I've been telling myself that for 30 years about a great many things, and I'm finding it harder to maintain." Harry considered his next words carefully. "If I needed someone who knew my parents," he said. "Who was at Hogwarts when they were there, who could speak to their character and their intentions for me, that would be useful to the case. A character witness. Technically a supporting deponent. It's different. It's a formal written testimony about specific facts, rather than general opinion." He paused. "You wouldn't need to say anything you don't know to be true. Only what you actually know." McGonagall looked at him. There it was again, that expression, not quite the way Ragnock looked at him, which was assessment, but something more personal than that. "You're 9 years old," she said. "I know," Harry said, which was becoming something of a refrain. "Do you want more tea?" She looked at him for another moment. Then she almost smiled, not quite, but the corner of one eye did something that might have been the start of it. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." They talked for 2 hours. Harry asked careful questions and McGonagall answered them, about his parents, about the war, about the Order of the Phoenix and who had been in it and what it had been for. Not everything she said was useful to the case directly, but Harry stored it all, because information was infrastructure, and you built on it later. Near the end, McGonagall said, "There's a girl in my incoming class this year, well, the class that would be yours, if you were enrolled." Harry looked at her. "I'll be enrolled next year." "I know that. I'm talking about someone else." McGonagall's expression had shifted into something more evaluative. "Hermione Granger. Muggle-born. She received her letter last month. Her parents are dental surgeons." A pause. "She's extraordinarily bright. She reads the way you apparently read, everything, all of it, constantly. And when she found out about the magical world, her first act was to go to the library and come back 3 days later with 17 questions about wizarding law." Harry processed this. "Why are you telling me about her?" "Because you're building a legal case that is going to get significantly more complicated before it gets simpler, and you're 9 years old, and you could use someone who can keep up with you." McGonagall paused. "Also because her parents are extremely alarmed by what they're reading in the Prophet about the wizarding world, and I think they'd like to speak with someone who has direct experience with why their daughter should still go to Hogwarts despite it all. And I'm that person." "You're an argument for the resilience of Muggle-raised children in the wizarding world," McGonagall said, with the dry precision of someone who'd been teaching for a very long time. "Among other things." Harry thought about a Muggle-born girl who'd received her Hogwarts letter and immediately gone to find 17 questions about wizarding law. "Set up the meeting," he said. The Grangers lived in a semi-detached house in Hampstead that was extremely clean and contained more books than Harry had seen outside of a school. He noticed the books first. They lined the hallway, the living room, what he could see of the study through an open door. Organized, too, which meant they were actually read, not collected for decoration. Emma Granger opened the door, looked at Harry, and then looked at him again with the expression of someone recalibrating. "You're the one from the Prophet?" she said. "Harry Potter," he confirmed. "I brought biscuits." He held up the paper bag. "Chocolate digestives. Professor McGonagall said you liked them." I'm not sure how she knew. Emma Granger blinked. Then she stepped back and let him in. The Grangers, Emma and Daniel, were people who asked very direct questions and expected direct answers, which Harry found refreshing. Daniel had a copy of the Prophet article on the coffee table with 3 sections circled in red pen, and he went through all 3 within the first 10 minutes, each time asking a question that cut straight to the thing he actually wanted to know rather than building up to it politely. Harry answered everything they asked. He didn't simplify it or soften it. He told them what he'd found in the Gringotts audit, what the case was about, what the current state of the ministry was, and why the wizarding world was, in his considered view, something between dangerously dysfunctional and deliberately unjust, but also the only world their daughter was going to have access to, and therefore worth fighting to fix rather than avoid. Daniel Granger listened to all of this, then said, "How old are you again?" 9. "And you're doing this alone?" "I have 12 goblin lawyers," Harry said. "Right." Daniel sat back. "Hermione," he called. "Come meet Harry Potter." There was a pause. Then feet on the stairs, fast and purposeful. She was smaller than Harry had expected, brown hair pulled back, front teeth slightly large for her face, eyes that moved the way his moved when he entered a new room, cataloging everything. She came in, sat down across from him, and said immediately, "Which accord provision are you using for the cognitive standing argument?" "Section 41, Harry said. "Why?" "Because I read the accord after the article came out and I think there's a stronger argument in Section 43, subparagraph 7. It's more specific to contested guardianship, and the language about beneficiary rights is less ambiguous." Harry looked at her. She looked back, slightly defiant, as though she expected him to dismiss her. "Show me," he said. She produced a marked-up copy of the accord from behind her back, where she'd apparently been holding it the whole time, and put it on the coffee table. Harry leaned forward. She leaned forward. They both looked at subparagraph 7. She was right. The language was considerably more specific. Griphook had mentioned this section in passing, but they'd focused on 41 because it was the more established precedent. But the subparagraph she was pointing to, a named beneficiary of sound cognitive faculty may invoke full legal standing in all matters pertaining to the direct management of their estate, regardless of age as defined in standard wizarding statutes, that was almost perfectly tailored. I need to show this to Ragnarok, Harry said. Obviously, Hermione said. Emma Granger, from the sofa, pressed her lips together very hard and looked at the ceiling. Does this mean she's going to Hogwarts? Daniel asked. That was never actually in question, Hermione said, without looking up from the document. On the bus back to Surrey, Harry sat in the upper deck with the accord in his lap, reading the subparagraph again and thinking about the shape of things. The hearing date still hadn't been set. The formal response from Bones was being reviewed. Dumbledore still hadn't made a direct move. But things were moving. The Prophet was paying attention. Bones had opened an investigation. McGonagall had come to him, which meant there were people inside Dumbledore's own circle who were beginning to pull away from the center of gravity. And now there was a girl in Hampstead with a copy of the Goblin banking accord and the very specific kind of mind that found subparagraphs other people missed. Harry looked out the bus window at London going by. Ordinary streets, ordinary people, no idea. He thought about the documents under his cot, and the 12 goblins with their quills, and the hearing that was coming. He thought about what winning actually meant, not just for him, but for all of it. For Sirius Black in Azkaban without a trial. For his mother's handwriting at the bottom of a page. For the house on Privet Drive and the cupboard and the 5 years of small, patient cruelties. He thought about Dumbledore sitting in his office reading that letter and going very still. The bus turned toward Surrey. Harry closed the accord. There was a great deal more to do. Chapter 3, Discovery. The hearing date came on a Monday, which Harry found less poetic than the Tuesday the letter had arrived on, but useful in its own way. Monday meant the wizarding world started the week with it on their minds. Ragnarok sent the news by owl at 7 in the morning, while Harry was making Uncle Vernon's eggs. The owl landed on the kitchen windowsill with the particular self-possession of an animal that had been doing this long enough to consider it routine, dropped the scroll, and left before Harry could even register that it had arrived. He read it in the 3 seconds between cracking the second egg and the third. Hearing scheduled. Wizengamot Chamber, October 14th, Presiding Panel, Madam Longbottom, Senior Arbiter Crouch, Acting Director Bones. Discovery Phase open September 1st, depositions to be scheduled through our office. We need you Friday. October 14th. 6 weeks. Harry cracked the third egg and didn't break the yolk, which was the important thing, because if he broke the yolk Vernon would eat it anyway and complain about it the entire time, and complaint required response, and response required attention Harry didn't currently have to spare. He pocketed the scroll, plated the eggs, and called that Vernon's breakfast was ready. Discovery, Brickshaw explained on Friday morning, was the phase of legal proceedings during which both sides were required to produce their evidence to each other. The point was transparency, in theory, no surprises at the actual hearing. In practice, it was the phase during which you learned exactly how much the other side knew, exactly where their weaknesses were, and exactly which of your own arguments needed shoring up before October. The defendants have 28 days to respond to our discovery requests, Brickshaw said, spreading documents across the conference table with the methodical care of someone laying out a surgical kit. We have the same obligation in reverse. Our discovery requests went out this morning. What did we ask for? Harry said. Everything. Brickshaw allowed himself the small professional satisfaction of someone who had spent considerable time constructing the word everything into something legally actionable. Full financial records for the Potter Trust, 1981 to present. All communications between named defendants relating to estate management decisions. The original emergency order and all supporting documents. Records of the Wizengamot proxy votes cast using the Potter seat. And the complete file on Sirius Black's arrest and detention, including whatever passed for due process. Which was nothing, Griphook said, from his end of the table, without looking up from his own folder. Which was nothing, Brickshaw confirmed cheerfully. Harry looked at the list. There was something deeply satisfying about the architecture of it, the way each request was a lever, and each lever was positioned precisely to move a specific weight. He'd spent the last 2 weeks studying discovery procedure with the same focused attention he gave everything, and he'd gone through it with Hermione the previous Saturday, sitting on her parents' living room floor with reference text spread between them while Emma Granger brought them sandwiches and periodically checked whether they were, in fact, children. Hermione had found 4 additional discovery targets that the legal team hadn't listed. 2 of them were already on the expanded draft Griphook had prepared. The other 2 were new, and Griphook had read them in silence for a long moment before writing something in his own notes with an expression that could most accurately be described as impressed and slightly annoyed. Depositions, Harry said. Who are we calling first? Ragnarok took over from Brickshaw. Under discovery, we can depose any individual with direct knowledge of the matters in question. We've identified 14 potential deponents. The most significant, he paused, is Albus Dumbledore. I want him first, Harry said. That's aggressive. I know. If he's deposed first, his testimony sets a baseline that every other witness either corroborates or contradicts. If he's deposed later, we can use prior testimony to corner him. Harry thought about this. He's going to come in prepared either way. He's had 6 weeks to prepare since the filing. What he hasn't had is the discovery documents. Once he sees what we've requested, he'll know exactly what we know. He paused. I want him first because he's going to assume that means we don't have enough to corner him yet. Let him think that. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. You want him to underestimate the deposition. I want him comfortable, Harry said. Comfortable people are honest in ways that careful people aren't. Another one of those silences. Sharpclaw, who was taking notes, stopped writing and looked up. First, Ragnarok said finally. I'll arrange it. The deposition room at the Ministry of Magic was nothing like the Gringotts conference room. It was a ministry room, which meant it had been designed by people who believed that authority was best communicated through ceiling height and the smell of old wood. The table was long and dark and covered in formal green felt. There were 3 arbiters' chairs at the head of the table, occupied by 2 ministry scribes and a magical recording device that looked like a large brass ear on a stand. Harry arrived before Dumbledore. He sat on the petitioner's side of the table, with Ragnarok to his right and Griphook to his left, and he looked at the room and thought about what he knew and what he needed and how those 2 things could be made to meet. Dumbledore arrived at exactly 10 o'clock. He was taller in person than Harry had imagined. Older, too, not the vigorous ancient of Ragnarok but something more worn, the kind of old that carries its own weight. He wore robes the color of midnight blue, which were not casual but not aggressively formal either, and he had half-moon spectacles on, and his white beard was precisely as long as every story about him suggested. He came in with his own solicitor, a thin wizard named Vance, who moved like a waiting bird, and took the respondent's seat across from Harry. Then he looked at Harry. And Harry looked at him. It was the first time they'd been in the same room. Harry had thought about this moment, practically and without sentiment, because sentiment in the room would cost him. He'd thought about what he would feel and concluded that he didn't know, and that was fine, and that what he felt was less important than what he did. What he felt, as it turned out, was a strange stillness. Not calm exactly, more the feeling of standing at the top of a very high place and looking down and finding that the drop was exactly as far as you'd calculated, which meant no adjustment was needed. Mr. Potter, Dumbledore said. His voice was warm. It was clearly professionally warm, but the professionalism didn't make it fake, that was the complicated part. The warmth was real. It existed alongside everything else. "Mr. Dumbledore," Harry said. Vance, the solicitor, stirred. "Chief Warlock, Mr. Dumbledore is fine," Harry said, without looking at Vance. "The Wizengamot Chief Warlock role is currently under review as part of these proceedings. Using the title in this context is prejudicial." Vance opened his mouth. The ministry scribe, without any expression whatsoever, wrote something on her parchment. Dumbledore raised one hand, very slightly, in a gesture that told his solicitor to let it go. His eyes hadn't left Harry. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Potter." The deposition began. It lasted 4 hours. Ragnarok led, because that was the structure they'd agreed on. Ragnarok handled the financial questions and the procedural questions, Griphook handled the estate documents, and Harry was to observe and take notes until Ragnarok gave him the floor for the direct questions at the end. This was both strategically sound and deeply counterintuitive for Harry, who was not by nature someone who sat still and waited. But he understood the logic. Let the goblins build the wall, brick by careful brick, and then Harry would be the thing that walked through it. He sat and watched and took notes. Ragnarok was extraordinary. Harry had known this from their first meeting, but watching him work in an adversarial setting was different from watching him in the conference room. He asked questions with the specific weight of someone who already knew the answer and was simply creating a formal record of the answer existing. He never raised his voice. He never showed frustration. When Vance objected, and Vance objected frequently, with the nervous energy of a man who knew exactly how bad the answers to some of these questions were going to be, Ragnarok addressed the objection in one sentence and moved on. Dumbledore answered carefully. This was the thing Harry had predicted and was now watching in real time, the answers of a man who was accustomed to being the smartest person in the room and had, over many decades, developed an extremely effective method of being honest about the things he couldn't deny while being artfully oblique about the things he could. He confirmed the management order. He confirmed the trust distributions. When asked about the specific recipients, he said they had been individuals vital to the post-war reconstruction effort, which was not a lie but was not the whole truth either, because reconstruction effort was a generous description of what the Order of the Phoenix had been doing in 1982 with money from a 9-month-old baby's inheritance. Then Ragnarok reached the black connection. "Did you, at any point during the processing of the emergency guardianship order, review the secondary guardianship provisions in the Potter will?" A pause. The brass ear on its stand rotated very slightly toward Dumbledore. "I was aware of the provisions," Dumbledore said. "That is not the question I asked." Another pause. Vance leaned toward Dumbledore and whispered something. Dumbledore listened, nodded once, and said, "I reviewed the secondary provisions." "Frank and Alice Longbottom were alive at the time of your filing," Ragnarok said. "They were not incapacitated until November 1, 1981, 3 days after the Potters' deaths and 1 day after your emergency order was filed." Silence. "For the record," Ragnarok continued, "were you aware on October 31, 1981, when you filed the emergency order, that Frank and Alice Longbottom were alive and available as secondary guardians under the terms of the Potter will?" Vance said, "Objection." "The question, I'll allow it," the ministry scribe said, without looking up. Vance sat back. Dumbledore said, after a very long moment, "I was aware." "You bypassed a living, able secondary guardian," Ragnarok said, "in order to place Harry Potter with Muggle relatives not named in the will, not known to the Potter family, and not consulted in the matter. The decision was made in the interest of—" "I'm not asking about interests," Ragnarok said. "I'm asking about process. Were the Longbottoms bypassed?" "Yes." Harry wrote on his notepad, "Confirmed bypass." "Both alive?" "No consultation." He underlined it once. Ragnarok moved on to the serious black question, and this was where the deposition changed texture. Because Dumbledore's answers about the financial management had been careful and strategic, the answers of a man who knew what was documented and was working around it, but his answers about Sirius Black were something different. They were the answers of someone who believed he'd been right. Sirius Black was identified as a Death Eater by multiple witnesses, Dumbledore said, and for the first time in 4 hours his voice had dropped the careful professional neutrality and become something more personal. The evidence was, there was no trial, Ragnarok said. The immediate post-war period was, under the Wizarding Justice Code of 1856, still in force. Every accused individual, regardless of the gravity of the charges, is entitled to a hearing before the Wizengamot within 30 days of detention. Was that hearing held for Sirius Black? Dumbledore looked at the table. No. Was one requested? The Ministry's position at the time, did you, in your capacity as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, request or initiate any such hearing for Sirius Black? The silence was very long. No, Dumbledore said. Harry wrote, admits omission. Direct. Then he stopped writing, because he didn't need to write anything else. He just looked at the old man across the table, who was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who had argued with himself about a decision 1,000 times and was encountering, for the first time, the formal record of it. After another 20 minutes of financial documentation, Ragnarok said, I'll turn the remaining questions over to Mr. Potter. Vance sat up sharply. The petitioner is a child, the petitioner is the primary named party in this proceeding, Ragnarok said. He has the full right of examination under discovery. Vance looked at the scribe. The scribe looked at her parchment. Confirmed, she said. Proceed. Harry set down his pen. He looked across the table at Dumbledore, who was looking back at him with an expression that was, and this was the thing Harry had not expected, the thing that made this more complicated than he'd wanted it to be, completely unguarded. No calculation in it. Just a man looking at a child and thinking about something very old and very heavy. You knew what was in the will, Harry said. Yes. You knew where I was meant to go. Yes. And you still put me at Privet Drive. Dumbledore didn't flinch. Yes. Why? Vance said, that question is outside it's directly material to intent, Harry said. Which is directly material to the fraud claim. You can object if you want. The scribe will note it. Vance closed his mouth. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and his voice was very level, because of the blood protection. Your mother's sacrifice created a magical ward that, as long as you lived with her blood relatives, provided you with protection against the threat that still, he paused. That I believed still existed. Voldemort, Harry said. Several people in the room reacted. The scribe didn't. Yes, Dumbledore said. You believed he was still a threat. I believed the possibility existed that he was not fully gone. So you made a unilateral decision to override a legal will, bypass living guardians, imprison a man without trial who might have been innocent, and take control of a child's entire financial and legal estate, based on a possibility. Based on the weight of responsibility I carried for, I know, Harry said. I've read the Order of the Phoenix records. I know what you did during the war. I know how many people would be dead if you hadn't done it. He paused, and the pause was not for dramatic effect but because the next thing he said needed to be exactly right. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about after. We're talking about a will, and 48 hours, and a choice. Dumbledore looked at him. You didn't ask anyone, Harry said. You didn't consult the Wizengamot, or the Longbottoms, or McGonagall, or any of the people who also cared about my parents. You just decided. And then you managed the consequences for 5 years and told yourself it was for the right reasons. It was, Dumbledore said quietly. I believe that. I know you believed it, Harry said. That's what makes it worse, not better. The room was very quiet. The brass ear had turned fully toward Harry and hadn't moved. After a long moment, Dumbledore said, You are, remarkably like your father. I'll take that as a redirect, Harry said. "We're done." Outside the ministry, on a wide grey pavement in central London, Harry stood in the mild September air and listened to the sound of the city. Ragnarok was beside him, and Griphook, and 3 of the other Goblin solicitors who'd attended as support staff. "That was effective," Ragnarok said. "I know," Harry said. He didn't say it with satisfaction. He said it the way you say I know about something that is true and also costs something. "The last exchange gets edited from the formal transcript," Harry said. "It was personal. It doesn't belong in the record." Ragnarok looked at him. It was also, strategically speaking, one of the most effective things said in that room today. "Strategy and record are different things," Harry said. "I don't need the whole world to know I called him out on his intentions. I just needed him to hear it." Another of those silences. Then Ragnarok said, with the particular flatness that Harry had come to understand was his version of warmth, "Your parents would have been proud of you." Harry looked at the pavement. He counted 3 cracks in the concrete, 2 cigarette ends, and 1 small coin that wasn't British. "Let's go over the deposition," he said. "I have questions about the Longbottom documents." They went. Hermione arrived for their Saturday session with 6 pages of notes on the deposition, which Harry had sent her a summary of, edited for the formal transcript, and the expression of someone who had been thinking hard about something for several days and was ready to argue about it. "The blood protection argument," she said, sitting cross-legged on her living room floor. "It's actually, in terms of the case, it's a problem." "I know," Harry said. "If the ward is real, and the books suggest blood wards of that type are real, they have a documented history going back to 15th century, yes," Harry said. "I read the same books." "It doesn't matter." Hermione looked up from her notes. "How does it not matter?" "He has an actual legal defense. The protection of the heir of a major house could be argued as grounds for emergency. The emergency provisions require demonstrated and immediate threat," Harry said. "Not possibility." Dumbledore's own testimony said he believed there was a possibility Voldemort was still a threat. Possibility isn't the same as demonstrated threat. And even a demonstrated threat doesn't allow you to override a legal will without Wizengamot approval. He picked up his own notes. "The blood ward is real. The protection is real. None of that means he was allowed to do what he did the way he did it. He could have done it legally, gone to the Wizengamot, made the case, got a ruling. He didn't. He just did it." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "Because if he'd gone to the Wizengamot, someone might have said no. Or asked questions he didn't want to answer," Harry said. "About the trust. About who he was planning to pay from it." She chewed her pencil. "That's the stronger argument. The blood ward defense is actually, yes, you're right, it doesn't excuse the procedural violations." "Write that up," Harry said. "In the format we used for the Accord subparagraph. I want to give it to Brickshaw before the week is out." "Right." She was already writing. Then, without looking up, "Do you ever stop?" "Stop what?" "Working. Planning. Moving things around in your head." She glanced up briefly. "We've been here 3 hours. You haven't looked out the window once." "I look out the window sometimes. It helps." Harry looked at the window. It had a view of the Granger's garden, which was tidy and green and very ordinary. "I'll look at it later," he said. "After you've solved wizarding law. After I've figured out the Longbottom documents," he corrected. She made a sound that was entirely fond and entirely exasperated in equal measure. Emma Granger appeared in the doorway with sandwiches and looked at the 2 children surrounded by legal texts on her living room floor. "I want it on record," she said, to no one in particular, "that I think this is either the most impressive thing I've ever seen or the most alarming." "Both," Hermione said. "Both," Harry agreed. Emma set down the sandwiches and went back to the kitchen, shaking her head in a way that was definitely not a smile. The other depositions happened in the following 2 weeks, and each one added a layer to the structure Harry was building. Cornelius Fudge came in sweating and defensive, confirmed everything the documents already showed, tried 3 times to suggest the trust management had been entirely appropriate under the circumstances, and discovered that Griphook had prepared a 40-page rebuttal to that specific phrase with citations going back to 1823. A ministry official named Dolores Umbridge came in because she'd co-signed a document relating to the Wizengamot proxy votes. She was small and pink and smiled throughout the entire deposition in a way that Harry found more alarming than anything Fudge had done. She denied everything with cheerful precision, citing proper procedure so many times that the brass ear on its stand seemed to lean slightly away from her. Harry asked her one question directly: "Are you aware of any Wizengamot votes in the last 5 years where the Potter proxy vote was cast in a way that directly benefited the named defendants or their associated interests?" She smiled. "I'm not aware of any impropriety, that wasn't the question. Are you aware of any such votes?" Her smile didn't waver. "I would have to review the records." "We already reviewed them," Harry said. "I'm asking if you're aware of them. Yes or no?" The smile held. "No." Harry wrote, "Perjury. Check against records." He underlined it twice. McGonagall came in on a Wednesday and gave her deposition quietly, precisely, and without flinching from any of it. She confirmed the contents of the Potter will as she'd understood them. She confirmed that she'd been told the emergency order was legally sound. She confirmed, carefully and without editorializing, that she had not been shown the order itself, only been told about it, and that she had not sought to see it. At the end, on her own initiative, without being asked, she said, "I would like it on the record that I believe Harry Potter was placed in circumstances inconsistent with his parents' known wishes and the legal provisions they made for him, and that I regret my own failure to scrutinize that decision at the time." The scribe wrote it down. McGonagall left without looking at Harry, which he understood. Some things were easier to say formally than directly. He let it be what it was. The deposition that mattered most came on a Tuesday at the end of September, in a smaller room, with only Harry and Ragnarok on the petitioner's side. Narcissa Malfoy came in like weather, not stormy, but the particular quiet before it. She was pale and precise and dressed in robes that cost more than most people's houses, and she sat down and looked at Harry and said, before Ragnarok could begin, "I'm not here to fight you." "I know," Harry said. She blinked, very slightly. "You know. You sent the meeting request 6 weeks ago. You waited until after the formal response. You came alone without a solicitor." Harry looked at her. "You're here to make a deal." "I'm here," she said carefully, "to discuss the Black Estate proceedings and how they might be handled in a way that serves everyone's interests." "Including Draco's," Harry said. She was quiet for a moment. "Including my son, yes. What's his inheritance status if the Black Estate settles in my favor?" "Complicated." She folded her hands on the table. She had long elegant hands and she held them very still. "If you are confirmed as collateral heir to the House of Black, the estate's primary instruments go to you. Draco's line through me maintains certain secondary instruments, properties, specific bequests, but the house seat and the primary vault would be yours. And you want to negotiate the secondary instruments. I want to ensure my son's future isn't casualties of a political fight that was never actually about him." Harry looked at her. She looked back. She was extremely good at not showing what she was thinking, but the thing behind her eyes, that was visible. It was the same thing McGonagall had shown in the tea room. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to the willingness to see clearly when you'd spent a long time choosing not to. "Tell me about Sirius Black," Harry said. She hadn't expected that. The stillness of her hands changed, became a different kind of still. "He's my cousin," she said. "He's in Azkaban without a trial," Harry said. "Which is relevant to the Black Estate, because if he's innocent, and we believe he is, then his guardianship rights over me potentially still stand, which affects the entire management order question. Sirius is, she stopped. Started again. He made choices that put him outside the family's protection. You were taught to say that, Harry said. Her eyes sharpened. I beg your pardon. You were taught to say that. It's the House of Black party line on anyone who got disowned. You say it automatically, even now. He leaned forward slightly. Do you actually believe he's guilty? A long silence. Long enough that Ragnarok put down his quill. No, Narcissa said, finally. The word came out like something she'd been holding under water for a long time. I've never believed he was a Death Eater. He was many things. A blood traitor by our standards. Rebellious. Difficult. A pause. He loved your father like a brother. Then help us, Harry said. Not with the Black Estate settlement, we'll figure that out separately, and I promise Draco's secondary instruments are not in danger. Help us with Sirius. He held her gaze. You know things about the war that aren't in any deposition we've taken. Family things. Who was where, who said what actually happened that night. If I testify about war matters, not as a defendant. As a witness with personal knowledge. Harry paused. And everything you say will be under the same discovery protections as everything else. Your name in the transcript stays sealed unless the panel orders it opened. She looked at him for a long time. Harry let her look. He didn't push. He'd learned, from Ragnarok and from reading and from 7 years of living with people who could not be rushed into decency, that some things had to find their own way to yes. My husband cannot know I'm here, she said. He doesn't know already, Harry said. That means you can keep that up. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, something more private than that. You're 9 years old, she said. Everyone keeps saying that, Harry said. I'm going to be 10 in July, for reference. She looked at him. Then she picked up the quill from the table, which was not hers to pick up, and she said, Tell me what you need. The night before the hearing, Harry sat in his cupboard with the door closed and a single torch and all 7 books arranged in a half-circle around him. He'd been through each of them twice. The notes in the margins were dense and coded and made sense to no one but him, which was intentional. He thought about what the morning would bring. The Wizengamot chamber, which he'd read about but never seen. The panel, Bones, Crouch, Augusta Longbottom, who was Frank Longbottom's mother and therefore personally connected to the bypass question, which was either good or complicated, probably both. He thought about Dumbledore's face in the deposition room. The unguarded moment. He thought about his mother's handwriting. He thought about Sirius Black, who had never had a morning like this, no preparation, no hearing, no moment when someone showed up with 12 lawyers and a sub-paragraph that changed everything. Just the island, and the dark. He'd work on that next. First, tomorrow. He opened his notes to the first page, found the starred argument at the top, and read through it one more time. Not because he'd forgotten it. Because some things were worth reading twice. Outside the cupboard, the Dursleys' house was dark and quiet. Number 4, Privet Drive, doing what it had always done, pretending nothing unusual was happening inside it. Tomorrow, Harry thought, is going to be a very different kind of Tuesday. He turned off the torch and closed his eyes. Chapter 4, The countermove. The morning of October 14th arrived grey and decisive, the kind of morning that had made up its mind about the weather before anyone woke up. Harry was dressed by 6:30, sitting on his cot with his notes in his lap, reading through the starred arguments one last time while the house around him groaned and shifted through its waking routines. Vernon's alarm. The shower. Dudley's thunderous descent for cereal. The specific creak of the 3rd stair from the bottom that happened every single morning and had for as long as Harry could remember. He'd told the Dursleys he was going to school for a special project. It was Saturday, so this was obviously untrue, but the Dursleys had reached a peculiar equilibrium with the ongoing situation that could best be described as aggressive non-acknowledgement. Vernon had received one letter from the Ministry, a standard notification that the Potter estate proceedings were active, which had apparently been sent to all parties of interest within a 1-degree connection of the case, and he had handled this by placing it in the bin, telling himself he'd placed it in the bin, and then retrieving it from the bin and locking it in his desk drawer, which Harry knew because he'd checked. The owl was waiting at the window when Harry stood up. Grey, businesslike, carrying a scroll and the particular air of an animal that found punctuality morally essential. He unrolled it standing up. Final briefing documents attached. Panel confirmed as scheduled. Bones has provided one additional disclosure, see attached. Vance filed 2 procedural objections yesterday evening, both denied by Bonds before 7 a.m. Be here by 8:30. R. The additional disclosure from Bones was a single page, a summary of her internal review of the trust management, written in formal ministry language but containing, about halfway down, a sentence that Harry read 3 times. The review has identified a pattern of transfers from the Potter family trust to individuals connected with a private organization operating under the designation Order of the Phoenix, totaling, over the 5-year period under review, an amount consistent with the sustained operational funding of said organization. Consistent with the sustained operational funding. Harry sat back down on the cot. He looked at the sentence. Then he looked at the ceiling. Dumbledore hadn't just redirected money from Harry's estate for incidental payments to Order members. He'd been running the Order of the Phoenix, the private wartime intelligence organization he'd founded, partially on Harry's inheritance. For 5 years after the war ended. Right, Harry said, to the empty cupboard. He folded the disclosure into his inside pocket, picked up his bag, and went to catch his bus. Ragnarok met him at the Gringotts entrance at 8:20, which was the first time Harry had seen him anywhere other than the conference room. Outside, in the early morning light of Diagon Alley, the old goblin looked exactly the same as he did underground, same contained authority, same yellow eyes that missed nothing, same complete absence of anything that might be described as hurrying. But there was something different in how he stood this morning. Straighter, maybe. The particular posture of someone who has been waiting a long time for a specific kind of fight. You read the Bones disclosure, Ragnarok said. On the owl. Harry fell into step beside him. It changes the financial argument. Significantly. The sustained operational funding characterization means we can argue not just mismanagement but deliberate ongoing misappropriation. That's the difference between negligence and intent. And intent is the difference between a civil remedy and a criminal one. Ragnarok glanced down at him. You've been reading further than I suggested. I read everything, Harry said. Where are we going? The Ministry's the other direction. We're picking up the rest of the team first. And, a brief pause, which from Ragnarok was the equivalent of anyone else clearing their throat significantly. There is something I should tell you before we arrive. Harry looked up at him. Vance's procedural objections last night were not the only moves made, Ragnarok said. An application was filed with the Wizengamot Administrative Office at 9 p.m., outside normal hours, by a solicitor acting for a coalition of 6 Wizengamot members. The application requests that the hearing be suspended pending a review of your legal standing to bring this case. Harry kept walking. On what grounds? 3. First, that a minor cannot serve as primary petitioner without an adult magical guardian's co-signature, they're distinguishing between the Accord's cognitive standing provisions and the Wizengamot's own procedural rules. Second, that your status as a Muggle-raised ward renders you insufficiently versed in wizarding custom to bring a case of this nature without formal representation by an adult wizard. Third, another pause. That your identification as heir to the House of Black is unproven, and therefore the case as constructed relies on standing you don't yet formally possess. Harry walked for another 20 seconds, watching the cobblestones go by. Who filed it? He said. The coalition is listed as concerned Wizengamot members acting in the public interest. The solicitor is a man named Reginald Cattermole. The interesting thing, Ragnok stopped walking and turned to look at Harry properly, which was something he did rarely and only when he wanted to be sure he was being heard. Is that none of the 6 Wizengamot members are named defendants? They're not in this case. They volunteered. Dumbledore organized them, Harry said. We cannot prove that. Not yet. Harry looked at the alley ahead of them. But if he organized them, it means the deposition rattled him more than I thought. He's not waiting to see what happens at the hearing. He's trying to prevent the hearing. Which suggests he believes the hearing will go badly for him. Which is the most useful information we've gotten in 6 weeks, Harry said. Can Bones deny the application? She already did. At 6:45 this morning. Ragnok allowed himself the small sharp expression. I told you she was exceptional. They'll appeal the denial. They already did. The appeal was assigned to the panel. So the hearing starts with the panel ruling on the standing challenge, Harry said, working through the structure of it. That's fine. That's actually useful. If the panel rules in our favor on standing before the main case even opens, every argument they try to make about the accord provisions is already dead. That was my assessment as well, Ragnok said. But there are 11 more things to tell you before we reach the ministry, so I suggest we walk faster. They were 11 things worth knowing. By the time Harry walked through the ministry entrance at 9:15, flanked by 12 goblins in formal legal robes that he'd never seen them wear before, dark grey with the Gringotts seal embossed at the collar, which turned out to transform a goblin from mildly alarming to extremely authoritative, he had processed all 11 and sorted them into the relevant arguments. The disclosure from Bones. The standing challenge and its 3 grounds. 2 additional witnesses who'd come forward since the depositions, both ministry employees who'd handled trust paperwork and apparently decided, upon reading the Prophet's coverage of the discovery phase, that they'd prefer to be on record as cooperative rather than complicit. And a letter from Augusta Longbottom, sent to Ragnok's office, not through official channels, saying that she was prepared to make a statement regarding the bypass of her son and daughter-in-law as secondary guardians, and that she had been prepared to make this statement for 6 years and was glad someone had finally asked. The Wizengamot chamber was not what Harry had expected. He'd expected formal grandeur, the kind of place designed to make you feel small. And it was grand, in the way that very old stone rooms are grand, with tiered seating rising steeply on 3 sides and a floor of dark polished wood and a ceiling that was higher than it had any practical reason to be. But it wasn't cold. It had been used too long for coldness. The stone had absorbed decades of arguments and verdicts and the particular human heat of people fighting about things that mattered, and it gave some of that back. The petitioner's table was on the left. Harry sat down at it, Ragnok to his right, the rest of the team arranged behind. He set his notes on the table and looked at the chamber while it filled. The Wizengamot members came in slowly, taking their tiered seats in their plum-colored robes. Harry counted. There should have been 50, and he got to 43 before the flow of arrivals thinned. 7 absent, which would normally be unremarkable. He wrote it down anyway. Patterns were only visible once you wrote things down. Dumbledore came in with Vance and 2 additional solicitors Harry hadn't met, and sat at the respondents' table across the chamber floor. He did not look at Harry. He looked at his documents, and the panel's chairs, and the ceiling, in a specific rotation that Harry read as the behavior of a man who was controlling exactly where his eyes went. He knew Harry was looking at him. He was choosing not to return it. That was information. The defendants section had, in addition to Dumbledore and his team, a separate table for the ministry defendants, Fudge, now officially under review, sitting with a ministry solicitor who looked like she'd rather be somewhere else, and 2 other officials from the trust management chain. Umbridge was in the gallery rather than at the table, which meant her solicitor had successfully argued for a limited respondent status. Harry had expected that. Amelia Bones entered last, from a side door with the other panel members, and took the center chair. She was a solid, square-shouldered witch with short gray hair and the specific expression of someone who had seen every kind of legal maneuver in the last 30 years and was prepared for all of them. She didn't look at Harry as she settled, but she looked at everyone else, and the look she gave the gallery told the room quite clearly that she intended to run this hearing the way she ran everything, by the code, nothing added, nothing subtracted. On her right sat Bartemius Crouch, Sr., who was thin and precise and looked like he found everything faintly disappointing. On her left sat Augusta Longbottom, who was wearing a hat with a ferocious stuffed vulture on it and whose expression suggested that she had opinions and was completely prepared to express them. "This hearing," Bones said, without preamble, "will come to order." The standing challenge took 40 minutes. Reginald Cattermole, representing the coalition of 6 Wizengamot members, laid out all 3 grounds with the professional fluency of a man who'd prepared this argument thoroughly and believed in it. He was good. Harry watched him and made notes and acknowledged privately that if Ragnarok weren't sitting next to him, this would be a more concerning 40 minutes. Ground 1, minor cannot be primary petitioner without adult guardian co-signature. Ragnarok stood, cited section 43 subparagraph 7 of the Accord, the exact provision Hermione had found in her living room 2 months ago, and pointed out that the Accord's provisions on beneficiary standing in inheritance matters superseded the Wizengamot standard procedural rules in cases where the subject matter was an inheritance dispute. He cited 4 precedents. He sat down. Bones looked at Crouch. Crouch looked at his documents. Augusta Longbottom had not moved a muscle. Ground 2, insufficient versing in wizarding custom. Ragnarok stood again, said in exactly 23 words that this was not a legal standard under any current statute and he would appreciate Cattermole identifying which statute it was drawn from, and sat down. Cattermole referenced a passage from a 1943 Ministry guidance document. Ragnarok pointed out, still in his chair, that a guidance document was not a statute. Bones said, sustained, without looking up. Ground 3, unproven black air status. This one took longer, because it was the most substantive. Cattermole argued that the case as constructed drew on 3 sets of air status claims, only one of which, the direct Potter line, was formally confirmed, and that the Wizengamot seat and Black estate claims could not be argued until the heir status was adjudicated in a separate proceeding. Ragnarok was halfway through his counterargument when Augusta Longbottom leaned forward in her panel chair. "Mr. Cattermole," she said. Cattermole stopped. "Are you suggesting," Augusta said, in the precise tones of a woman who had been fighting in committee rooms for 30 years and found them all equally tiresome, that this panel should decline to hear a case on the grounds that one element of the petitioner's standing requires further investigation, when that investigation would take place before this same panel? Cattermole opened his mouth. "Because what you're describing," Augusta continued, "is a request for us to excuse ourselves from ruling on a question that is properly ours to rule on the grounds that it is ours to rule on. Which is," she looked at him with an expression that made her vulture hat seem, somehow, appropriate. "Not how this works. Madam Longbottom, I merely, will hear the black air claim as part of the main proceedings," Bones said, with the finality of someone closing a file. "Standing is confirmed on the Potter and procedural grounds. The black air question will be ruled on as part of the hearing itself." She looked at the room. "We'll take a 15-minute recess and then begin the main case." The chamber broke into noise. Harry wrote, "Standing confirmed." He underlined it. Then he put his pen down and looked at Ragnarok. Subparagraph 7, Ragnarok said, without turning his head. "Tell Griphook to send Hermione something nice," Harry said. Ragnarok made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. The recess was 15 minutes on the clock and approximately 40 years long subjectively. Harry stood near the petitioner's table, not wandering, because wandering looked uncertain, and drank a glass of water that someone had placed there, and watched the room reorganize itself the way rooms do when something significant has just happened and people are recalculating. Several Wizengamot members in the gallery were talking in tight clusters. He caught fragments, his name, Dumbledore's name, Gringotts, the prophet, and he watched faces and filed what he saw. 7 members absent. Now he counted 11 people in the gallery who had their heads together in a specific configuration that wasn't casual conversation. There were different kinds of worried, and these faces wore the kind that had a specific reason behind it. He was looking at that when someone appeared at his elbow, which almost never happened because Harry had a peripheral awareness of approaching people that came from years of necessary survival skill. He turned. Narcissa Malfoy was not supposed to be in this chamber today. She was not a named defendant. She was not on the witness list. She was in the gallery as a private observer, which she was entitled to be, but she had no business at the petitioner's table. She was at the petitioner's table. She leaned down slightly to bring her voice close to his ear without it carrying, and she said, "Lucius knows about the deposition." Harry looked at her without showing anything. "How?" "Someone in the Ministry legal office has been reporting to him." "I don't know who." Her voice was very flat. Not afraid, but with the texture of controlled urgency. "He knows I gave testimony. He knows about the Black Estate discussion. What is he going to do? He's going to push the 6-member coalition to make a second motion. Not about standing, about bias. He'll argue that the panel is compromised because Augusta Longbottom has a personal connection to the bypass claim." Harry thought about this quickly. Augusta Longbottom's son and daughter-in-law had been the bypassed secondary guardians. She had a direct family interest in that particular question. It wasn't the strongest bias argument, she wasn't a named defendant, and her interest was arguably aligned with the petitioners rather than any respondent, but it was a real argument. "If they get Augusta removed from the panel," he said. "The panel drops to 2 members, which requires adjournment to convene a full panel, which takes 30 days minimum," Narcissa said. "This hearing doesn't reconvene until November." "And in November, Fudge's formal term review," Harry said. He knew the ministry calendar. He'd memorized it 2 months ago. If Fudge survives the review, he can rescind the conflict recusal and reassign the case. "Yes." They looked at each other for a moment. Then Harry said, "Why are you telling me this?" She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Because I made a choice 6 weeks ago in a deposition room, and I've made a great many choices before that I'd like to balance out before my son is old enough to watch me make them." She straightened. "I'm going back to my seat." "Thank you," Harry said. She walked away without responding, which was its own kind of response. Harry turned to Ragnarok, who had been standing 3 feet away and heard every word. "The bias motion," Harry said quietly. "I heard. We need to preempt it. If we wait for them to file it, we're reacting. If we address it first, we acknowledge the appearance of conflict before they can weaponize it," Ragnarok said. He was already turning it over. "Propose that Augusta Longbottom be recused from the specific question of the secondary guardian bypass and that question be heard separately by Bones and Crouch alone. While she remains on the panel for everything else. The motion partially validates itself by being made voluntarily. And it removes the grounds for the bias claim entirely, because we already addressed it." Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Harry with something that was distinctly not assessment anymore, something more direct than that. "When they filed that standing challenge this morning, I wondered if you'd be unnerved by it." "Were you?" Briefly, Ragnarok said. "Yes." "I wasn't," Harry said. "Because if they're trying to stop the hearing is working." The recess bell rang. Harry stood up when Bones called the chamber back to order, and before Cattermole, who had been conferring urgently with someone in the gallery during the recess and had clearly received his instructions, could get to his feet, Harry said, "Before we begin, the petitioner requests permission to address a procedural matter." Bones looked at him. "Proceed." The petitioner acknowledges that panel member Longbottom has a direct family connection to one specific element of the case, the question of secondary guardian bypass. In the interest of procedural integrity, the petitioner voluntarily proposes that Member Longbottom be recused from that specific question only, with that element to be heard before a two-member panel of Director Bones and Senior Arbiter Crouch. Member Longbottom would continue to hear all other elements of the case. The chamber was quiet. Cattermole was on his feet and then not on his feet and then on his feet again, which was telling. Augusta Longbottom was looking at Harry with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between sharp approval and something more personal. The petitioner makes his own procedural motion, Bones said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite dry humor but was adjacent to it. Respondents? Vance stood. The respondents have no objection. Cattermole sat down. Motion accepted, Bones said. We'll proceed. Harry sat down. In the gallery, he could see, very briefly, a pocket of 6 Wizengamot members who had just run out of their morning's ammunition and were recalculating what to do about it. He gave them one quick look, because he was human and 9 and allowed to feel things, and then he looked at his notes. The main case took the rest of the day. Ragnarok opened with the financial summary, clean, documented, specific. Numbers and dates and signatures. The trust withdrawals. The order of the Phoenix connections. The Bones disclosure about sustained operational funding, which he read aloud in its entirety and left sitting in the room's air for a full 5 seconds before moving on. Fudge's solicitor tried to reframe the trust management as authorized emergency spending and got dismantled, procedurally and arithmetically, in a way that was efficient enough to be almost kind. Vance argued the blood ward defense, which Harry had prepared for, and Griphook presented the counter-argument that Harry and Hermione had built on her living room floor, the demonstrated versus possible threat distinction, the procedural requirement for Wizengamot approval, the specific statute that Dumbledore had bypassed. Crouch, who had been largely silent through the morning, asked 3 sharp questions about the statute's application that indicated he'd read it carefully. Griphook answered all 3. Crouch wrote something down. The serious black question came in mid-afternoon, and Ragnarok presented the 1856 Justice Code provision with the Azkaban detention timeline laid over it like a transparency, making the absence of a hearing visible as a shape rather than just a fact. He noted that the petitioner had reason to believe Black was innocent of the charges for which he'd been imprisoned and that the estate and guardianship implications of Black's wrongful imprisonment were significant to the case. Vance objected that the innocence question was outside the scope of the current proceedings. We're not asking the panel to rule on Black's innocence, Ragnarok said. We're asking the panel to note that he was imprisoned without the trial that the law required, and that this omission directly affected the execution of the Potter will. The question of innocence is a separate matter for separate proceedings. Bones looked at Crouch. Crouch looked at his documents. Noted, Bones said. Then it was Harry's turn. He stood up and the chamber was different when he was standing than when Ragnarok was standing. He didn't know exactly why. Possibly it was because he was so obviously a child in a room full of adults, which was either a disadvantage or an argument in itself, depending on how you looked at it. He suspected most people in the room were looking at it as a disadvantage, which was fine. He'd prepared a statement. He'd written it 4 times, cutting it down each time, taking out everything that was argument and keeping only what was fact with a human face on it. He knew that Ragnarok had already made the arguments. What Harry needed to do was something different. I'm not going to tell you what I think about the decisions made in the 48 hours after my parents died, he said. He wasn't reading from the statement, he'd internalized it. I don't think what I think about them is the relevant thing. The relevant things are in the documents that have already been presented, and in the testimony you've already heard. The chamber was very still. But there is one thing I'd like to say, and then I'm done. He looked at the panel, at Bones, at Crouch, at Augusta Longbottom, who was watching him with that unreadable expression. I was 9 years old when I walked into Gringotts for an audit. I didn't come in looking for a case to bring. I came in because a letter arrived, and I was told to go, and I went, and while I was there I looked at some documents and asked some questions, and the answers made the shape of something I didn't expect. He paused. "I'm not asking you to give me anything that isn't mine," he said. "I'm asking you to look at the shape of what the documents show, and at the law as it was written, and tell me whether what happened to my parents' estate, whether what happened to me, is consistent with that law." He looked at the chamber. "That's all. The law either says what it says, or it doesn't." He sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Bones said, "The panel will deliberate." They deliberated for 2 hours. Harry sat at the table and worked through his notes because there was nothing else to do, and nothing was helped by thinking about what was happening behind the panel's door. Ragnarok read documents. Griphook reorganized folders with the focused energy of someone who needed to be doing something with his hands. Around them, the chamber filled with the sustained low noise of 50 people waiting for something. Dumbledore, across the floor, had not moved in 40 minutes. He was looking at the same page of the same document. Harry watched him without being obvious about it, which he was good at, and he thought about what it must feel like to be at the end of 60 years of very careful work and to be watching the architecture of it be examined, brick, by a child you'd made a decision about in a hospital corridor 9 years ago. He didn't feel sorry for him. But he understood him, which was different, and that was going to matter for what came next. It was going to matter because what came next wasn't just the ruling. The ruling was almost, not irrelevant, but not the whole point. The case would generate a ruling, and the ruling would restore the estate, and the Wizengamot seat, and the black heir status. All of that was necessary, and none of it was the point. The point was Sirius Black on an island. The point was the Order of the Phoenix being paid from Harry's inheritance while the people who could have raised him properly were either imprisoned or incapacitated. The point was that winning in this room today was the beginning of the next case, and the next one after that. He thought about all of this while the chamber waited, and he was still thinking about it when the panel door opened and Bones walked back out. "This panel," Bones said, when the room had settled into the particular silence of a verdict, "has reviewed the evidence presented and deliberated on the following claims." She read them one by one. Financial mismanagement of the Potter Family Trust, sustained. The management order as executed was found to exceed its legal authority in directing estate funds to non-estate purposes without beneficiary or Wizengamot approval. Improper invocation of emergency guardianship provisions, sustained. The application was filed without completing the required review of available secondary guardians under the will. Failure to execute the provisions of the Potter will, sustained. The will's guardianship provisions were bypassed without legal authority. Violation of the 1856 Justice Code in relation to the detention of Sirius Black, noted and referred. The panel found the evidence of procedural violation compelling, but ruled that the specific question of Black's detention was outside their direct jurisdiction and must be referred to the Department of Magical Law for formal investigation. On the question of black heir status, Bones continued, and the chamber was very still. The panel finds that the evidence of collateral heir status through the Doria Black line is sufficient to warrant formal recognition of provisional heir status pending confirmation hearings. 3 things. All 3. As to remedy, Bones said, and this was the part Harry had prepared for, and also the part that turned out to be nothing like he'd prepared for, in the specific way that the most important things always diverged from their preparation at the last moment. The management order is dissolved, effective immediately. Full control of the Potter estate, accounts, properties, voting rights, and trust, is restored to the primary beneficiary. A pause. The Wizengamot seat currently held in proxy is likewise restored, pending the petitioner's formal induction at age 11. Harry wrote nothing. He just looked at the panel. In the matter of the Chief Warlock proxy, Bones said, and here she looked up from her document and out at the room rather than at the text, the panel notes that the improper exercise of said proxy across multiple Wizengamot votes in the last 5 years represents a significant procedural irregularity, and recommends a full audit of those votes. The chamber noise rose and then fell as people caught Bones's expression. Finally, she looked directly at Harry, for the first time in the proceedings. The panel is aware that the petitioner is 9 years old and resides with Muggle relatives whose guardianship has now been superseded by the dissolution of the management order. The panel directs the Department of Magical Law to arrange appropriate wizarding guardianship for the petitioner as a matter of urgency, pending the outcome of the Black Detention Review. She set down the document. This hearing is closed. The chamber exploded. Harry stayed in his seat while the noise rose around him. People were standing, moving, talking, several apparently arguing with each other in the tiered seats. Vance was leaning toward Dumbledore saying something urgent. Fudge had gone a very specific color. Cattermole was nowhere to be seen. Ragnarok stood quietly beside Harry's chair and said nothing, which was correct. After a moment, Harry looked up at him. "The seat," Harry said. "It's technically mine now. Even before the induction." "In proxy," Ragnarok confirmed. "The proxy reverts to you rather than to Dumbledore. You can designate a holder until you're of age." "Augusta Longbottom," Harry said immediately. "She was meant to be my guardian. She can hold the seat." Ragnarok looked at him. "That's a choice she should have been able to make 6 years ago," Harry said. "Ask her." Across the chamber floor, Dumbledore was standing now, his documents in his hands, and he looked across the space to the petitioner's table. He met Harry's eyes. It was a long look. The kind of look that was trying to figure out what to say, and finding that none of the usual things applied. Harry held it without effort, without aggression, without the satisfaction he'd expected to feel. What he felt was something simpler. The feeling of an equation balanced. The working checked, no errors. Dumbledore gave a very slight nod. Harry nodded back. Then he picked up his bag, because he had 11 more things to do today, and Sirius Black was still on an island, and the case for getting him off it needed to start before the end of the week. He was 9 years old, and he had never been more certain of where he was going next. Chapter 5, The Wizengamot. 3 weeks after the hearing, 2 things happened on the same day. The first was that a letter arrived from the Department of Magical Law confirming that the formal investigation into Sirius Black's detention had been opened, assigned to a senior investigator, and classified as priority review, which was ministry language for we looked at this and realized very quickly that it was bad. The letter was signed by Amelia Bones personally, which was not standard procedure for a departmental notification, which meant she was making a point. The second was that Harry came home from Hermione's house to find his cupboard had been padlocked from the outside. He stood in the hallway of number 4, Privet Drive, looking at the padlock. It was a new one, silver, heavy, bought specifically for this purpose, which meant someone had gone to a shop to purchase it, which meant it was a decision rather than an impulse. Vernon was in the sitting room. Harry could hear the television. He knocked on the doorframe. "Lock's on my cupboard," Harry said. Vernon didn't look away from the television. "You don't live there anymore." Harry processed this. "Where do I live?" "Not here." Vernon's jaw was tight. "You've made your choices, boy. Done your business with your lot. Fine. But this is my house, and I won't have it." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Vernon was staring at the television with the fixed concentration of a man pretending an awkward thing wasn't happening. "The panel directed the ministry to arrange guardianship," Harry said. "Until that's sorted, I'm still legally a ward of this household." "Don't use that tone with me, I'm going to need somewhere to sleep tonight," Harry said. "And food. That's all I'm asking for right now." Silence. The television laughed at something. "The spare room," Petunia said, from the kitchen doorway. She wasn't looking at either of them. She was looking at the wall beside the door with the expression she wore when she was making a decision she found difficult and had decided to disguise as practicality. "The camp bed's in the cupboard under the stairs. He can set it up in the spare room." Vernon said, "Petunia, it's temporary," she said. "Just until, it's temporary." Harry went and got the camp bed from behind the padlock, because the padlock was on the outside of the door, and set it up in the spare room, which smelled like cardboard boxes and old carpet, and lay on it in the dark and read the Bones letter 3 more times. Priority review. He was going to need to understand exactly what that meant procedurally, and exactly how fast it could move, and exactly what evidence they'd need to produce. He fell asleep thinking about Sirius Black on a rock in the sea. The guardianship question resolved itself faster than anyone expected, largely because Augusta Longbottom moved faster than anyone except possibly Augusta Longbottom expected. Harry met her formally for the first time on a Thursday, 10 days after the hearing, in an office at the ministry that Bones had made available for the purpose. It was a small office, 4 chairs, a window overlooking an air shaft, a plant that had seen better decades, and when Augusta Longbottom arrived in it she made it feel considerably smaller, not because she was large but because she occupied space in a way that left nothing to spare. She sat down, looked at Harry, and said, "I knew your father at school." "I know," Harry said. "You were 2 years above him. Professor McGonagall mentioned it." Augusta's expression was sharp and assessing and not unkind. "He was a decent boy," she said. "Better than the reputation he had in his 5th year, which was admittedly not his finest period." A pause. "Your mother I liked considerably. She was one of those people who said exactly what she thought and managed to make it sound like the most reasonable thing possible." Harry said nothing. He'd found that when people wanted to tell him about his parents, the most useful thing was to be very still and not interrupt them, because they'd been carrying whatever they were carrying for a long time and interruption made them put it back down. "You have her eyes," Augusta said. "I know. And his complete inability to be told what to do. Also no." She looked at him for another moment. Then she sat back. "The guardianship arrangement. I want to understand what you actually want from it, not what the panel required." "A legal address," Harry said. "And someone who can sign the school paperwork, and someone the ministry can contact if there are legal questions they need to route through an adult." I'm not asking for," he paused, which was rare. He paused because the next thing was more complicated than the legal structure, and he wanted to get it right. "I can look after myself. I've been doing it a long time. I'm not looking for someone to look after me." Augusta looked at him. Her expression had done something that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Ragnarok at the signing, that measuring, recalibrating look that landed differently from standard adult assessment. "Frank would have been good at this," she said quietly. "Looking after you. He was patient with children, which is a thing not everyone is." Harry held very still. "My daughter-in-law too," Augusta said. "Alice. A breath. Not ragged, controlled, the breath of someone who had learned to keep a very large thing in a very small space because life had required it. They're still alive. I want you to know that. The healers say there's no reason to assume." She stopped. "Anyway." "I know," Harry said. And then, because it was true and because he thought she needed to hear it said plainly, what happened to them matters to the case. Not just yours or mine. Whoever attacked them, that night, after the Potters, that's still an open question. And open questions don't stay open forever." Augusta looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "You're already planning the next one." "I've been planning the next one since October," Harry said. "Sirius Black didn't act alone, by the evidence. And whoever he's supposed to have been working with is still," he paused. "Still a question." Augusta was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'll sign the guardianship papers." "Thank you," Harry said. "Don't thank me. I'm doing it because I should have done it 5 years ago and someone with considerably more legal power than me decided I couldn't." She straightened her hat, the vulture hat, which apparently she wore everywhere, and which Harry had decided was probably more intentional than it looked. "You'll come to Longbottom Manor on weekends when school isn't in session. I have a grandson roughly your age. He's a gentle boy. He'll either be very good for you or be completely overwhelmed by you, and I'm genuinely not sure which yet. I'll try not to overwhelm him, Harry said. Don't make promises you can't keep, Augusta said. It's a poor legal habit. Harry almost smiled. Noted. November moved quickly. The Black investigation progressed. Ragnarok sent regular updates through the Grey Owl, who had by now established the spare room window at Privet Drive as a permanent fixture of its route and seemed to regard the arrangement with professional satisfaction. Harry read each update and sent back questions, and received answers, and built the picture layer by layer. Sirius Black had been arrested on November 1, 1981, in a street in Godric's Hollow, surrounded by the remains of 12 Muggles and 1 Peter Pettigrew. He had been laughing. Everyone who was present agreed on the laughing, and everyone had interpreted it the same way: grief-stricken breakdown, guilty conscience, the particular madness of someone who had done something terrible and lost himself in it. Harry had read this account 3 times and thought about it differently each time. Why would he be laughing, he asked Hermione, on a Saturday in December, sitting on her living room floor with the investigation summary spread between them. Hermione looked at the page. Grief can manifest, I know how grief can manifest, Harry said. But if he'd just betrayed his best friend to be killed, and 12 Muggles were dead, and he was surrounded by Aurors, the specific thing that grief manifests as in that moment isn't usually laughter. Hermione was quiet for a moment. It's what you do when something goes wrong that you didn't expect, Harry said. When something surprises you. You laugh because you can't. He stopped. Peter Pettigrew was supposed to be the secret keeper. That's what the investigation found. Black gave up the secret keeper role specifically because he thought he was too obvious a target, and Pettigrew was safer. So if Pettigrew was the secret keeper, then Pettigrew was the one who told Voldemort where they were, Harry said. And Pettigrew faked his death and disappeared. And Sirius found him, or found out, and Pettigrew blew up the street to kill the Muggles and create a crime scene and framed Sirius, and then transformed and ran. He looked at the page. And Sirius was laughing because it was so, because he'd done the one careful thing, the one thing he thought would protect them, and it was the thing that got them killed, and then the person who did it walked away. Hermione was very still. That's what the laughing is, Harry said. It's not guilt. It's the specific horror of someone who just understood something. Emma Granger appeared in the doorway. She looked at the two of them, and then at the papers, and then at her daughter's face. Everything all right? Yes, Harry said. No, Hermione said, simultaneously. Emma looked at Harry. We've been working on why an innocent man is in prison, Harry said. It's going well, but it's not cheerful. Emma pressed her lips together. I'll get more tea, she said, and disappeared. Hermione looked at Harry. You need to find Pettigrew. I know. He could be anywhere. He's been gone for 9 years. She glanced at the relevant page. Animagus. An unregistered rat animagus. I know. How do you find an unregistered rat animagus who's been hiding for 9 years? Harry picked up his pen. I don't know yet, he said. That's why we're working on it. December moved into January and January moved into the grinding grey middle of February, and Harry read and planned and sent owls and received owls and went to Gringotts twice more and spent weekends at Longbottom Manor, which was large and cold and full of herbology specimens and a boy named Neville who was, as Augusta had predicted, either very calmed by Harry's presence or completely overwhelmed by it, probably depending on the day. Neville Longbottom was soft-spoken and kind and quite good at plants and absolutely terrible at believing he was capable of anything, which Harry found quietly maddening in the specific way that you find maddening the thing that is most different from you. But he was funny when he forgot to be nervous, and he was fiercely loyal once he'd decided to be, and he never lied, which Harry put above almost every other quality in a person. Your dad, Harry said, one evening in February, sitting in the Longbottom Manor greenhouse while Neville repotted something that smelled like cinnamon and regret. What do you know about him? What happened? Neville kept his hands in the soil. Gran says they were tortured, he said. Looking for Voldemort. His location, or whatever was left of him. Someone wanted to know. Bellatrix Lestrange, Harry said. And 3 others. 2 of them are in Azkaban. Rabaston Lestrange. One whose name I can't find in the records. Neville was quiet. I'm telling you this, Harry said, because I think you should know. Not because it helps the case. Just because it's yours. Neville put his hand still in the soil for a long moment. Then he said, without looking up, "Are you going to do something about it?" "I'm going to do everything that can legally be done about it," Harry said. "That's what I can promise." Neville nodded. Very small, very tight. Then he went back to the plant. Harry watched him for a moment, then picked up his book. That was the thing about Neville. You didn't need to fill the silence with him. The silence just was what it was, and it was fine. March arrived with the thing Harry had been expecting since October. The Wizengamot voted to strip his titles. He'd known it was coming. Ragnarok had flagged it as a possibility in November, a procedural mechanism available to the Wizengamot in cases where the confirmation of heir status was being contested, which was what the remaining Dumbledore allied members had been building towards since the hearing. Not a reversal of Bones's ruling, they couldn't do that without grounds. But a suspension of the formal titles and their associated rights, pending a confirmation review that they controlled the timeline of. It was clever. Harry gave them that. It was the kind of clever that understood that winning a hearing wasn't the same as consolidating a position, and that a 9-year-old with provisional heir status to 3 houses was a great deal less dangerous than a 9-year-old with confirmed heir status to 3 houses. The vote happened on a Tuesday, still the correct day for important things, and the final count was 31-19 in favor of the suspension. The 7 members who'd been absent at the October hearing were all present for this one, which told him something about who'd organized their attendance. The morning after, Harry sat in the Gringotts conference room with all 12 goblins and read the notification letter, which was written in very formal language that was trying very hard not to sound like what it was. "They've taken the seats," he said. "Not angry." "Processing." "Suspended," Brickshaw corrected. "Not revoked." "The mechanism requires reinstatement within 18 months, unless a confirmation panel finds grounds to make it permanent," Harry said. "I know." He set the letter down. "The confirmation panel," Ragnarok said. "They'll try to control its composition." "They already are," Harry said. "Cattermole filed a panel composition request yesterday. I had the Grey Owl bring me the prophet at 6 a.m. He's proposing 3 members, all of whom have either direct or familial connections to the Dumbledore network. That will be challenged," Griphook said. "Of course it will," Harry said. "We'll challenge it and probably win the challenge, and they'll refile with a slightly adjusted composition, and we'll challenge that, and somewhere in the middle of it all the actual confirmation hearing will happen." He looked at the ceiling. "This is what they want. They want me in process. They want me in meetings and challenges and procedural filings indefinitely. They want me here," he gestured at the conference room. "Instead of out there, doing the next thing." "The Sirius Black investigation," Ragnarok said. "The Sirius Black investigation," Harry confirmed. "Which is the one they can't procedurally slow down, because Bones controls it. So while I'm in here fighting about panel composition, I'm not out there being useful to Bones." The room was quiet. "We split," Harry said. "Half the team stays on the title suspension, challenge everything, slow the process down, make it expensive for them. The other half works with me directly on the black evidence." He looked at the team. "I want Ragnarok, Griphook, and Sharpclaw on the black case. Everyone else on the suspension. Is that workable?" "It's workable," Ragnarok said. "But I want to be clear about something first." Harry looked at him. The title suspension, losing the seats, the formal heir status, does it change anything for you? Ragnarok asked. Not in a challenging way. In the way of someone who'd watched a person operate for 7 months and wanted to understand what they were actually working toward. Harry thought about it honestly, which took a moment. No, he said. The titles were always the mechanism, not the point. The point is Sirius. The point is what actually happened in 1981 and who's still walking free because nobody asked the right questions. He paused. The Wizengamot can take the titles. They're welcome to them for now. I'll get them back. And while they're busy celebrating taking them, I'll be building the case that makes everything else they've done visible in a way they can't manage. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Right, he said. Then let's begin. The Sirius Black hearing happened on a Thursday in April, and it was nothing like the October hearing. It was smaller, to begin with. Not the full Wizengamot chamber but a dedicated review room in the Department of Magical Law, with walls that had been repaired recently and smelled faintly of fresh plaster. No tiered gallery. 3 seats for the panel, Bones, and 2 senior aurors with review authority, and 2 tables and a door at the back that had a guard outside it. Harry arrived with Ragnarok and Griphook and sat at the petitioner's table, which was technically the supporting party table, because this was Bones's investigation and Harry was appearing as a supporting witness with submitted evidence rather than a primary petitioner. He was fine with that. Some fights were better as supporting roles. Dumbledore was not present. This was not his hearing. Fudge was, technically, present. His name was listed among the individuals called to account for the lack of trial, but his solicitor had filed a medical notice citing stress-related symptoms, and Bones had granted a testimony in writing provision without visible enthusiasm. Harry sat down and waited, and watched the door at the back. Sirius Black came through it at exactly 9:30. He was thin. That was the first thing, and the most visible. Not thin the way Harry was thin, which was the thin of someone who got enough food some of the time. This was a deeper thinness, the kind built over 9 years of very little. He was tall and had been broad-shouldered and the shoulders were still there structurally but without the weight behind them, and his hair was long and his eyes were gray and very sharp, which was the second thing. He was looking at everything in the room. Not frantically, sharply, with the fixed attention of someone who had spent 9 years in a place where the walls didn't change and was recalibrating to a room that did. He sat down at the witness chair and then, because people can't help where their eyes go, he looked at the supporting party table. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. Sirius Black went absolutely still in the way that only happened when something very large and unexpected arrives in your chest and requires processing. He stopped. He looked at Bones. Then back at Harry. That's James's, Harry James Potter, Bones said, not unkindly. Yes. He's the reason this review was opened. Sirius looked at Harry for another long moment. Then, very quietly, in a voice that had been through a great deal, you have her eyes. I know, Harry said. Everyone says that. Something crossed Sirius's face. Something that started as grief and came out, by some alchemy of 9 years of survival, as a very rough laugh. Of course they do, he said. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Bones was methodical and relentless and exactly as good as Ragnarok had described her, and the evidence that Harry's team had assembled was thorough enough that the structure of what had actually happened on November 1, 1981 became visible within the first 90 minutes like a photograph developing. Peter Pettigrew. The Fidelius charm. The deliberate switch of secret keepers 2 weeks before the Potters died. The street in Godric's Hollow. The 12 Muggles. The finger. The rat that ran. Sirius answered every question. He didn't ask for softness or sympathy. He gave facts in the flat, compressed way of someone who has organized their memories into something they can present without being undone by them, and Harry recognized that compression from somewhere internal and didn't name it. The critical piece was a document that Griphook had found during discovery, not in the main estate files but in a subsidiary archive of Order of the Phoenix correspondence, one of the folders from the financial records that had been part of the trust evidence. It was a note in James Potter's handwriting, dated October 17, 1981, addressed to Dumbledore. It said, "Padfoot suggested the switch today and I think he's right. Wormtail is less obvious. We're changing the charm on Friday. Wanted you to know." Dumbledore had known about the switch before it happened. He'd known the secret keeper was Peter Pettigrew. And he'd never mentioned it, not when Sirius was arrested, not when the case was being built, not when the Aurors were reporting that Pettigrew was dead and Black was guilty. He'd let it go. Not from malice, Harry had come to believe, and he'd spent a long time coming to believe it. From the specific human failure of a person who needed a particular story to be true in order for everything else to hold together, and who'd allowed that need to override a question he should have asked. The note went into the evidence bundle. Bones read it in silence. The two senior Aurors read it in silence. "Mr. Black," Bones said. "Under the authority of this review panel, I'm prepared to make a preliminary ruling. The formal process will take, how long?" Sirius said. 2 to 3 weeks for the full documentation." She looked at him directly. "But I can tell you now, for what it's worth, you shouldn't be here." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "And Pettigrew?" "Is now subject to an active warrant," Bones said. "Finding him is another matter." "I know what he looks like," Sirius said. "As a rat." "I know," Bones said. "We'll talk about that." After the hearing, in the corridor outside while Ragnarok organized documents and the guards were discussing something at the end of the hall, Sirius found Harry standing near the wall. He stood in front of him and just looked at him for a moment. Harry let him look. "They told me in there," Sirius stopped. Started again. "The guardianship. You're with Augusta Longbottom." "Temporarily," Harry said. "The formal arrangement is, I know what the formal arrangement is. Ragnarok briefed me this morning." Sirius's voice was rough and his eyes were very direct and something in them was asking a question he hadn't put into words yet. "I want to, when this is done. When the review is finished. I want to," he stopped again, and the stopping was not from lack of words but from the weight of what the words would mean if he said them, after 9 years. "You were named in the will," Harry said. "Yes." "My parents chose you." "Yes." Harry looked at him. This was the thing he'd been working toward for 8 months, through every filing and every deposition and every owl at the window in the dark. This was what the documents had pointed to, all of them, from the very first page Ragnarok had slid across the table. Not the title. Not the seat. Not the money, which had never been interesting except as an instrument of justice. This. "Then when it's done," Harry said, "we'll figure it out." Sirius Black, who had survived 9 years on the strength of one conviction, who had held on to a specific memory of a specific boy in the belief that he had to get out and explain and fix it, stood very still in a ministry corridor and nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "We will." They didn't get the moment to themselves for very long because Ragnarok reappeared with 3 more documents that needed immediate signatures, which was appropriate. The work continued. It always continued. That was the nature of things built carefully rather than quickly. Harry signed the documents. Outside, London was doing its usual spring thing, that tentative brightness that never quite committed in March but began to mean business by April. He could see it through the corridor's single window, a slice of pale blue and the top of a tree. He had a title suspension to fight. A confirmation panel to challenge. Pettigrew to find. A year until Hogwarts. Neville's parents in St. Mungo's and Bellatrix Lestrange in Azkaban and a list of open questions that ran to 2 pages. He also, for the first time, had something he could trace back through 8 months of work and 12 Goblin signatures and a letter in his parents' handwriting, something that had not been there at the start of any of it. He had somewhere to go. He picked up his bag, nodded to Ragnarok, and went through the ministry's exit into the April afternoon. Chapter 6, The Foundation. 1 year later, Harry Potter turned 10 years old in a garden. Not the Dursleys' garden, which had been his primary gardening experience and which he associated with kneeling in dirt while Dudley watched television through the back window. This was the Longbottom Manor garden, which was a different enterprise entirely, sprawling and slightly wild at the edges, the kind of garden that had been tended by people who genuinely loved plants rather than people who wanted the neighbors to be envious. There were roses that climbed the east wall with the ambitious confidence of things that had been climbing for decades and intended to keep going. There was a greenhouse that Neville disappeared into most mornings the way other people disappeared into books. There was a long section of lawn that caught the afternoon sun at precisely the angle that made it the best place to sit and read, which Harry had discovered in October and claimed quietly as his. Augusta had organized a birthday tea with the specific efficient warmth of someone who had not done birthday teas for a very long time and was applying full capability to the enterprise. There were sandwiches cut into triangles, which Harry found faintly extraordinary. There was a cake that Neville had helped make and that listed slightly to one side, which Neville had apologized for 3 times and Harry had told him to stop apologizing for once. Hermione was there, with Emma and Daniel Granger, who had taken to the wizarding world with the same systematic approach they took to everything. Emma had borrowed 6 books from Harry's collection and returned them annotated, and Daniel had developed a working theory about the relationship between magical ability and certain forms of neural architecture that he explained with great enthusiasm to anyone who would listen. Ragnarok was not there, because Ragnarok did not attend birthday teas. He had sent a card, which was apparently unprecedented in Gringotts' institutional history, and which said, "Happy Birthday. You have 3 new documents requiring signature. Come Tuesday." Harry had put it on the windowsill in his room at the manor, where it sat beside a photograph of his parents that McGonagall had sent in November. His mother was laughing at something off camera. His father had his arm around her and was looking at her with an expression Harry had decided he didn't need to analyze. He just liked looking at it. The tea was in the afternoon, and the afternoon was July and warm and unhurried, and for a while Harry sat on the lawn with a sandwich and Neville beside him in companionable silence and let the day be what it was without trying to organize it into the next thing. "You're thinking," Neville said. "I'm always thinking." "You're thinking loudly. You do this thing with your jaw when you're working through something." Harry put a hand to his jaw. He hadn't been aware of that. "What are you thinking about?" Neville asked. "Pettigrew," Harry said. Neville was quiet for a moment. "They haven't found him." "No." Harry lowered his hand. "Bones has had the warrant out for 11 months. He's an unregistered Ratanimagus. He could be anywhere." He looked at the far end of the garden, where Hermione was explaining something to her father with the animated gestures she used when the topic was genuinely interesting to her. "Sirius says he favored human households. Around people. Somewhere he could hear things." "That's horrifying," Neville said. "Yes. Have you told Bones that?" "Sirius has. She's cross-referencing, looking for households with unusual rat activity, pet rats in proximity to sensitive ministry employees, things like that." He picked up his sandwich. "It'll take time." "You're frustrated," Neville said. "I'm patient," Harry said. Neville looked at him. "Those aren't the same thing." Harry ate his sandwich and thought about that. He was patient. He'd been patient for a year, through every procedural delay and every countermove and every motion filed at 9 p.m. by people trying to slow things down. But patience wasn't the same as not wanting the thing to be done. "He's still free," Harry said. "While Sirius spent 9 years, while your parents are," he stopped. "Pettigrew's the one who actually did it. All of it. And he's in someone's garden eating cheese." "We'll find him," Neville said, with the quiet certainty that he brought to things he'd decided to be certain about, which was rarer and more deliberate than it looked. Harry looked at him. "You sound sure." "You're working on it," Neville said simply. You don't leave things unfinished. Harry looked back at the garden. The roses on the east wall were doing their confident climbing thing. The greenhouse caught a glint of sun off one of its glass panels. He thought, 10 years old. 1 year since the audit. Everything that had changed. Then he stopped cataloging changes and just sat in the afternoon, because it was his birthday, and the sandwich was good, and Neville was right that he didn't leave things unfinished, which meant the unfinished things would wait. The title suspension confirmation hearing had been scheduled, rescheduled, challenged, adjusted, and rescheduled again 4 times between November and June, and Harry had developed a comprehensive and detailed understanding of exactly how the Wizengamot's procedural machinery could be weaponized by people who controlled enough of it. Each filing generated a counterfiling. Each composition challenge generated an appeal. The whole apparatus moved with the grinding slowness of institutional resistance, which was, he'd come to understand, the point. They were trying to exhaust him. He was 10. He had more energy than the Wizengamot. The confirmation hearing finally convened on a Wednesday in the second week of August, in the full Wizengamot chamber with a panel of 5 members that had been agreed upon after 3 rounds of composition challenges and 1 formal ruling by Bones's office on panel neutrality requirements. The 5 were, Griselda Marchbanks, who was old and precise and had no obvious loyalties to anyone living, Tiberius Ogden, who was a known centrist, Amos Diggory, who'd been appointed to fill the vacancy left by Fudge's formal resignation, Edgar Bones, Amelia's uncle, who was present under the approved reasoning that familial connection to the investigator was not the same as personal connection to the parties, and Arcturus Knott, whose presence Harry's team had objected to twice before Bones ruled that his connection was too peripheral to disqualify. Knott was the one to watch. Harry knew that. He'd said so to Ragnarok the night before, and Ragnarok had said he knew, and they'd prepared accordingly. The confirmation hearing worked differently from the October hearing. The standing challenge was already settled. The financial claims were already ruled upon. What the confirmation hearing addressed was the formal status of the 3 heir claims: Potter, confirmed; Black, provisional; Peveril, tenuous, and whether those claims, as presented, met the standard for full confirmation. Brickshaw handled Potter. It was clean and short, and the documentation was impeccable, and Marchbanks confirmed it inside 20 minutes, which was the procedural equivalent of a formality with extra steps. Sharpclaw handled Peveril, which was the most argumentative element. The bloodline trace was real, but the records were old and the confirmation standard for ancient and lapsed house claims was high, and Arcturus Knott found 3 separate grounds for challenge before Sharpclaw finished the opening submission. Harry watched Knott carefully and wrote down every challenge and saw the pattern in them. They were all process-based, not evidence-based, which meant Knott knew the evidence was solid and was trying to generate procedural grounds for a negative finding. Mr. Knott, Marchbanks said, after the 3rd challenge, in the tone of someone who had been running hearings for longer than Knott had been alive, the panel will hear challenges when the submission is complete. Not during it. Knott sat back with the expression of a man who had been trying something and had been told clearly that it hadn't worked. Sharpclaw completed the Peveril submission. The challenge arguments were heard, answered, and 2 of the 3 were sustained, meaning 2 of Knott's process objections were upheld, narrowing the scope of the Peveril confirmation significantly. Not eliminated, but narrowed. Harry had known this was the likely outcome. The Peveril claim was the weakest of the 3 and the most politically convenient to reduce, and he'd planned around that. Then Ragnarok stood for the Black claim, and the hearing changed character. The Black heir status was not procedurally complicated. The bloodline documentation was excellent. The evidence of the Doria Black connection was direct and well supported. What was complicated was the political weight of it, because confirming Harry Potter as heir to the ancient and noble House of Black meant confirming him as heir to one of the oldest and most powerful families in the wizarding world, and everyone in that chamber who had an investment in a particular distribution of power knew exactly what that meant. Knott filed 6 challenges during the Black submission. Marchbanks sustained 1, a minor documentation technicality that required a 3-day adjournment to correct, and dismissed the other 5. The adjournment was called. Harry sat at his table during the recess and did not look at anyone in particular. He heard the movement of the gallery, the clustering conversations, the specific noise of people recalculating their positions. He'd heard versions of this noise several times now. It had a texture he recognized, the particular sound of people deciding which direction to face. Across the chamber floor, the respondents' table was quiet. Vance was still there, technically, representing the procedural interests of the original management order, but the weight on his side of the room had changed over the year. In October, that table had carried the full authority of Dumbledore's position and the Ministry's institutional inertia. Now it carried the weight of things that had been audited and documented and read aloud in formal proceedings, and that was a different and considerably less comfortable weight. Dumbledore himself was in the gallery. He'd come every day of every hearing, which Harry had noticed and thought about. He could have sent Vance alone. He could have disengaged. But he came, and he sat, and he watched, with the expression of a man fulfilling an obligation he'd set himself. Harry didn't know if that was penance or stubbornness or both. He thought it was probably both. The adjournment lasted 3 days and then the black submission resumed and Ragnarok finished it in 40 minutes and the panel deliberated for 2 hours and came back with a confirmation. All 3 houses. Potter confirmed, Peverell confirmed in limited scope, Black confirmed. The titles that the Wizengamot had voted to suspend in March were restored, effective immediately, with a formal notation in the record that the suspension mechanism had been applied improperly, which was the closest thing to an official rebuke available within the Wizengamot's own procedural language and which Marchbanks had insisted on including over Knott's objection. The chamber was loud again. Different loud from October, not the shock of the new but something more complex, the noise of a year-long argument reaching its formal conclusion. Harry sat at the table and wrote one word in his notes, done. Then he crossed it out, because it wasn't done. Pettigrew. The Lestranges. The remaining questions about the war. He wrote, next. Then he put his pen in his pocket, because some moments were better not organized into the next thing immediately, and he let himself sit in the chamber for a while as it emptied, listening to the sound of it. Sirius was outside the ministry entrance, leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, waiting. He'd been officially cleared in May. The 2 to 3 weeks Bones had promised had become 8, because the formal process was what it was, but the ruling had been clean and complete, wrongful imprisonment without trial, full expungement, formal apology from the ministry in language that the new minister, who was not Fudge, had apparently written himself. The compensation proceedings were ongoing, managed separately from Harry's case but with Ragnarok's office providing documentation support, and Ragnarok was approaching that particular fight with an enthusiasm that suggested he found institutional compensation negotiations genuinely enjoyable. Sirius looked better than he had in April. Not fully, 9 years didn't come back in a few months, but better. He'd cut his hair. He was wearing robes that fit properly. He had color in his face and something in his eyes that was starting to look like present tense rather than just survival. Well, he said. Confirmed, Harry said. Sirius let out a breath that had been held for some time. All 3? All 3. Peverell's limited scope but confirmed. Sirius shook his head slowly. You're going to be the most complicated 10-year-old in the history of wizarding Britain. I've been told I'm already the most complicated 9-year-old, Harry said. The bar moves with me. Sirius looked at him, and there it was, the same thing Harry had seen in the corridor in April, that complicated layering of grief and guilt and determination and something newer than those things. Your dad would have loved this, he said. This specific thing. Watching you do this. He paused. He'd also have been absolutely insufferable about it. Told everyone he met. At length. McGonagall said he was insufferable in 5th year, Harry said. He was. We were terrible. Sirius said it with the precise affection of someone visiting a memory they hadn't allowed themselves to visit fully for a long time. We were also, in our defense, very 17. I'll try not to hold it against him. They stood outside the ministry in the August afternoon, which was warm and unhurried, and Harry thought about what came next, which he couldn't entirely stop himself doing, but which he let stay soft-edged for the moment. The guardianship, Harry said. The formal arrangement with Augusta, it's good. She's been, he paused, because the word good was insufficient and he didn't have a better one ready. She's been good. I know, Sirius said. She told me. At some length. A pause of his own. I'm not trying to, I'm not going to show up and expect anything, Harry. I know I haven't. You were in Azkaban, Harry said. That's not, you were in Azkaban for 9 years for something you didn't do, Harry said, because someone decided not to ask the right questions. That's not your fault. None of what happened is your fault. He looked at Sirius directly. The will names you. I've read the will. I know what my parents wanted. He paused. I'd like to know you. That's what I want. Everything else we can figure out. Sirius was quiet. Also, Harry said, I'm at Hogwarts in September and you're going to need something to do, so if you want a project I have about 14 ongoing legal matters and Pettigrew still needs finding. Sirius made a sound that was specifically and entirely a laugh, not the rough thing from the ministry corridor but something real and surprised, the laugh of someone ambushed by a good moment. 14, he said. Ongoing. The number varies week to week. Of course it does. Sirius shook his head. Remus is going to lose his mind when he meets you. Who's Remus? Old friend. He'll be fine. He's good with complicated. Sirius looked at him. Moony was always the sensible one. We need a sensible one, Harry said. We definitely need a sensible one. They walked away from the ministry into the afternoon. Not quickly, not with direction, just walking, the way you walk when you've been somewhere for a long time and it's time to not be there anymore. September came with the Hogwarts letters and the lists and the trip to Diagon Alley that was nothing like Harry's first one, because this time he went with people, and this time the people knew what they were doing, and this time the money was his and the choice of wand was his and nobody was waiting in a lobby furious about it. His wand chose him in Ollivanders after 11 tries, which Ollivander said was slightly above average in terms of patience required and which Harry thought was appropriate. Holly and Phoenix Feather, 11 inches, nice and supple. Ollivander held it for a moment after Harry had given it the test wave and the shower of gold and red sparks had cleared, and he said, curious. Very curious. Why curious? Harry asked. The phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand, Ollivander said, with the look of a man who was genuinely uncertain whether to continue, gave another feather. Just one other. It is very curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar. Harry touched his forehead. The scar was there, as always, a small, lightning-shaped reminder of a night he didn't remember. He'd thought about it differently over the past year. Not as a wound anymore. More as a data point. Do you know what happened to the other wand? Harry asked. Destroyed, Ollivander said. Or as good as. That which wielded it was, well. Not entirely gone, if rumor is true. But no longer capable of wielding much of anything. He looked at Harry over the tops of his glasses. For now. For now, Harry repeated. He looked at his wand. Thank you. He paid and went out into the alley where Sirius was waiting, and Hermione was coming out of Flourish and Blots with considerably more books than the list required, and Neville was standing outside the apothecary looking at something in the window with the specific focus of a person who has just found their subject. This, Harry thought, was a different kind of shape from the one he'd been building in conference rooms. Hermione, on the train to Hogwarts, said, there are going to be people there who know about the case. I know, Harry said. Some of them will have opinions. I know that too. Draco Malfoy's going to be in our year, she said. And his father, Lucius Malfoy is not a named defendant, has no formal case against him, and has no legal grounds to do anything in this situation," Harry said. "Draco Malfoy is 11. He paused. "Although I'd prefer not to have a problem with him, if it can be avoided." "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about everything." He looked out the train window at the countryside going green and fast. "Narcissa's been, she took a risk in that hearing. Whatever Draco's like, she did something real. So you'll be nice to him?" "I'll be fair," Harry said. "That's what I can actually promise." Hermione made the sound that meant she was going to argue and then decided not to, which he'd learned to recognize over a year of working sessions in her living room. Neville was asleep across from them with his robes pulled up and his toad Mr. Trevor on his chest, rising and falling with his breathing, which Harry found inexplicably reassuring. The train went north. Harry had a Transfiguration textbook open on his knee, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking at the countryside and thinking, in a loose, non-organized way that he rarely allowed himself, about the year behind him. The audit. Ragnarok's yellow eyes across a conference room table. The 12 signatures. The letters, the owls, the filings. Hermione's subparagraph. McGonagall's tea. Narcissa's hands very still on the table. Amelia Bones and the word sustained. Sirius in a ministry corridor saying you have her eyes and meaning something entirely different from everyone else who'd said it. Augusta's garden. Neville's greenhouse. The photograph on the windowsill. The titles, suspended and restored. The voice votes and the procedural challenges and the exhausting, grinding, necessary work of making an institution do what it was supposed to do by showing it, brick by brick, what it had been doing instead. He thought about Dumbledore, who was still Chief Warlock, that had not changed, because the audit of the proxy votes was ongoing and the outcome was uncertain and institutions protected their leaders until the very specific moment they didn't. He thought about Dumbledore sitting in that gallery for every day of every hearing, and what that meant. He'd asked Ragnarok once, near the end of the confirmation hearings, whether he thought Dumbledore was dangerous now. Whether all of this had made him an enemy. Ragnarok had thought about it in the way he thought about everything, carefully, fully, without performing certainty. Then he'd said, "I think he is a man who believed he knew best for a very long time and has spent this year discovering in precise and documented detail all the ways that belief failed the people it was supposed to protect. I think that is more dangerous in some ways than simple opposition." A pause. "I also think he has too much genuine intelligence not to know it." "Is that good or bad?" Harry had asked. "Complicated," Ragnarok had said. Harry had filed that under ongoing and moved on. Hogwarts arrived after dark, which was the correct way for it to arrive, enormous and lit against the sky, the kind of building that was less about architecture than about the accumulated weight of what had happened inside it. Harry looked at it from the boats and felt something he couldn't immediately categorize. Not awe exactly. More like recognition. The feeling of arriving somewhere that had been waiting for you, which was different from the feeling of arriving somewhere you were expected. "It's bigger than I thought," Neville said, from the boat beside his. "Everything is," Harry said. "That's not philosophically helpful," Hermione said, from his left. "It wasn't meant to be philosophical," Harry said. "I just mean the castle is physically larger than the descriptions I'd read suggested." "Oh," she said. "Yes, the estimations in Hogwarts, a history are, not now," Harry said. "Right," she said. "Right, yes." The boats moved across the Black Lake and the castle grew, and around Harry were 140-odd 11-year-olds seeing it for the first time, and most of them were looking at the building and Harry was looking at them, briefly, because people were always worth looking at. Their faces in the castle light. Fear and wonder doing their usual negotiation. He turned back to the castle. 1 year. 12 goblins. 3 heir claims. 2 hearings and a review and a man freed from a 9-year wrongful imprisonment and titles suspended and titles restored and a Wizengamot that had been, if not reformed, at least made uncomfortable with itself, which was sometimes the beginning of reform. Pettigrew was still out there. The war's questions were still open. Dumbledore's proxy vote audit was unresolved. The Peveril claim in limited scope needed building out. And somewhere out there, not gone the way everyone had told themselves he was gone, something that had killed his parents was still, as Ollivander had said, with careful precision, not entirely gone. But not tonight. Tonight was the castle and the Black Lake and the boats and the 140-odd new beginnings. The boats touched the far shore and they climbed out and walked up toward the light. McGonagall met them at the door. She looked at the crowd of 11-year-olds with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and then her eyes found Harry in the group, which took about 1 second. She looked at him with the expression he'd first seen in a tea room in Muggle London, the one that was part assessment and part something more personal, and then it shifted into something more purely professional because they were in a doorway with 139 other children. "Welcome," she said to the group. "In a moment you'll enter the Great Hall for the sorting. Please follow me quietly." She turned. Harry followed. In the doorway, just before they entered the hall, she said, without turning, just audible, "I have your Transfiguration textbook corrections on my desk already, Mr. Potter." Harry looked at the back of her head. "I sent those 3 weeks ago." "I know," she said. "I've been working through them." A pause that might, in different company, have been described as fond. "They're correct." "I know," he said. They walked into the great hall. The Sorting Hat sat on a stool at the head of the hall, old and patched and carrying about it the particular authority of very old things that have been thinking for a long time. Harry looked at it while the students arranged themselves in a line, while McGonagall unrolled the list of names, while the hall murmured and 4 tables looked up with 4 different kinds of attention. He'd thought about the sorting. He'd thought about it the way he thought about every element of a new environment, what it would do, what it would expect, what he wanted from it and whether what he wanted and what it decided would align. He'd thought about which house. About what the houses meant, not in the promotional sense but in the functional sense. He'd read their histories, their notable members, their track records across the last century of wizarding events. He'd thought about what he needed for the next 7 years in terms of environment, proximity, resource. He'd also thought, but the hat might have its own ideas. He was fine with that. He was fine with things that had their own ideas, as long as they were honest about them. The names were called alphabetically, and Harry watched each sorting with the specific attention he gave everything, and filed what he saw. Lavender Brown went to Gryffindor. Millicent Bulstrode to Slytherin. Hermione, when her name was called, walked up with her chin out and sat on the stool, and the hat took a long 4 seconds before calling Gryffindor, which made her exhale a breath she'd clearly been holding. Draco Malfoy was Slytherin before the hat touched his head, which was either the hat respecting an obvious decision or Draco having very strong opinions, and given what Harry knew of the family, probably both. Neville was Gryffindor, after a hat pause that lasted long enough to make him visibly anxious, and when the word was called he came off the stool looking surprised and faintly delighted, which was precisely the right response. Potter, Harry. The hall went quiet. Not the polite silence before each name but a different silence, the kind with weight behind it. Harry heard his name move through the room like water finding cracks, murmurs, the creak of benches, whispered Potter. That ran from the first-year line all the way to the back of the hall. He walked up the aisle and sat on the stool, and the hat dropped over his eyes and the world went dark and full of old thinking. "Well," said the hat, in a voice that was entirely internal and somehow ancient and dry and curious all at once. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Harry said, silently. "Something quieter," the hat said. "Something more manageable." A pause. There was a quality to the hat's thinking that was less like a personality and more like an environment, the way a very old library feels like a thing that thinks. "You've done extraordinary things for a 10-year-old. I had good lawyers." "You had yourself," the hat said. "The lawyers were a tool." You found the tool and built what you needed with it. A pause. You could go almost anywhere, you know. Ravenclaw, the mind you have would find a natural home there. Slytherin, the ambition, the strategy, the willingness to play a long game. They'd want you. I know, Harry said. But you know where you're going. I think so, Harry said. Tell me if I'm wrong. The hat was quiet for a moment. Not considering, Harry had the sense it had already considered. More the pause of something that was deciding how to say the thing it had already decided. The brave ones, the hat said, are not always the loudest. Sometimes bravery looks like a 9-year-old walking into a bank alone and asking why things are the way they are. Another pause. You'll do well in Gryffindor, the hat called, loud enough to ring off the high ceiling. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry lifted the hat off his head, handed it back to McGonagall, who took it with a carefully controlled expression that was trying hard not to be a smile, and walked to the Gryffindor table where Hermione was clapping and Neville had gone red with the effort of being enthusiastic without knocking anything over. He sat down. The noise settled. The sorting continued. Harry looked at the high table, where Dumbledore was sitting in the center, watching the sorting with the composed attention he always had. He met Harry's eyes across the hall. That look again. The one Harry had learned to read, the specific quality of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and had complicated feelings about all of it. Harry held the look. Then Dumbledore did something Harry hadn't seen him do in any proceeding, any deposition, any formal moment of the last year. He nodded. Small, deliberate, without the calculation that had been in every other gesture they'd exchanged. Just a nod. Harry looked away, because Percy Weasley was pushing a plate of chicken his direction and Neville was asking him something about the case, which he'd apparently been reading about, and Hermione was already explaining to the girl next to her what subparagraph 7 was and why it mattered, and the hall was warm and full and the food was real and plentiful in a way that still, after a year at Longbottom Manor, surprised him slightly. He ate his dinner. Across the table, Neville found his toad in his pocket and looked so relieved that Harry laughed, really laughed, the kind that catches you off guard, and Hermione looked at him with an expression of pure surprise, because it was the first time she'd heard it, and apparently it sounded like something she hadn't expected. What? Harry said. Nothing, she said. You just, nothing. He shook his head and passed her the potatoes. Later, much later, after the sorting and the feast and the walk up through corridors that smelled like stone and old wood and hundreds of years of people passing through them, after the fat lady's portrait and the common room and a dormitory that had 5 beds and was small and warm and smelled like wool, Harry lay in the dark with the curtains open slightly and looked at the castle ceiling. The other boys were asleep. Ron Weasley, who he'd been sorted with and who had strong opinions about chess and Quidditch, was snoring softly. Neville had Trevor the Toad in his bedside drawer and was sleeping with the specific peace of someone who had not needed to fight the day too hard. Harry stared at the ceiling. He thought about tomorrow, which would be the first day of classes, and the teachers, and the other students, and the particular new shape of this place and what it would require and what it would give. He thought about Sirius, who was at Grimmauld Place now, his ancestral home, reclaimed through the Black Estate proceedings, which had been a whole separate legal adventure that Griphook was still working through. Sirius had described it as dark, cold, full of things that wanted to bite you, and probably salvageable. He thought about Neville's parents at St. Mungo's, which was the unfinished thing that sat heaviest, because there was a limit to what law could do there, and the limits were specific and real. He thought about Pettigrew. He thought about what Ollivander had said, not entirely gone, and what that meant and what it would eventually require. He thought about a lot of things. He couldn't entirely stop. That was the honest truth about his mind, which Hermione had been right about. It didn't stop, it found the next thing, it was always somewhere slightly ahead of the present moment. But he was here too. In the bed, in the dormitory, in the castle. Actually here, in the present, in the specific warmth of this room with these particular people sleeping in it. Neville, who was brave in the quiet way that was harder than the loud way. Hermione, 2 floors down in her own dormitory, who had taken a sub-paragraph and changed the shape of a legal case and still found time to argue about it. Sirius, who had held on to one thing for 9 years and it had been enough to survive on. Augusta, who held the proxy and grew things and wore the vulture hat because she'd decided a long time ago to be exactly what she was. Ragnarok, who sent birthday cards and said they were unprecedented. His father's arm around his mother's shoulder. Her eyes. Harry looked at the ceiling. The case was not over. Cases like this were never over, they generated new cases and new questions and the work continued. That was the nature of it. The foundation you built was not a finish line. It was what you stood on when you built the next thing. He was 10 years old. He had a wand made from a brother of the wand that had given him his scar. He had an owl, a legal team, a guardian, a friend who'd found the right sub-paragraph, and a dormitory full of people who didn't know yet what they were going to be to each other. He had 12 goblin lawyers and 3 heir claims and a year of work behind him and considerably more in front of him. He had everything his parents had wanted him to have and nothing that had been taken from him had stayed taken. Harry Potter pulled the curtain closed, put his head down, and went to sleep. Tomorrow was a school day, and he had Transfiguration first, and then there was the Pettigrew search to advance, and the Peveril claim to build out, and the proxy vote audit to monitor, and about 11 other things. But tonight the work was done. He closed his eyes. Slept.